resolución pacífica de las controversias y el reconocimiento de los dos estados, Israel y Palestina, así como el derecho de ambos a coexistir en armonía dentro de fronteras internacionales seguras y reconocidas y con pleno respeto a los derechos humanos de todos sus habitantes. Esta solución, sin embargo, está muy lejos de ser una realidad, lo que ha tomado un nuevo cariz a partir de los actos terroristas perpetrados por Hamas el 7 de octubre pasado. Condenamos sin matices y de forma inequívoca las acciones de Hamas, al igual que todo acto terrorista, hechos de violencia y hostilidades contra la población civil. Por ello, también llamamos a la liberación incondicional de todos los rehenes en manos de esta organización que cometió actos terroristas, velando por su bienestar y trato en conformidad al derecho internacional. De la misma manera, nos preocupa la operación militar de Israel en Gaza. El ejercicio de la fuerza en el marco de la legítima defensa de un Estado que haya sido atacado debe estar guiado por los principios de la proporcionalidad, distinción y precaución. No obstante, a la luz de los hechos, esto no se está cumpliendo, pues desde el 7 de octubre han sido bombardeadas infraestructura pública, viviendas de civiles, centros educativos y de salud, incluyendo instalaciones de la propia Agencia de las Naciones Unidas para los Refugiados de Palestina en Oriente Próximo, UNRWA. Nos inquietan estos recientes ataques y el recrudecimiento de la violencia en intensidad y frecuencia por el impacto que esto tiene en vidas humanas, heridos, destrucción de familias, huérfanos, soledad, desesperanza y la pérdida de sentido y fe en la vida misma. No cabe duda que esto marcará a varias generaciones y una vez que las balas se detengan, otras consecuencias comenzarán a sentirse, porque en la guerra no existe racionalidad. Definitivamente la violencia no se soluciona con más violencia. De igual forma, el bloqueo israelí a la Franja de Gaza ha impedido el ingreso de suficientes alimentos, agua, insumos médicos y fuentes de energía, todos ellos elementos esenciales para la existencia humana. A esto se debe sumar la orden de evacuar el área norte de la Franja de Gaza, que es un ejercicio de desplazamiento forzado de la población. Todos estos hechos atentan con las disposiciones del derecho internacional humanitario y los derechos humanos. Solicitamos que estos sean investigados por las entidades internacionales competentes para determinar y exigir las eventuales responsabilidades de los actores involucrados. Chile, de acuerdo con los principios permanentes de su política exterior, en el seno de esta organización ha adherido a las decisiones referentes al respeto al derecho internacional, la preservación de la paz, el ejercicio de la autodeterminación de los pueblos, como también el respeto y promoción de los derechos humanos. Así, en relación con el pueblo palestino, hemos desarrollado una posición permanente en el tiempo, respaldando el derecho del pueblo palestino a constituir un Estado soberano, enmarcado en lo prescrito en las resoluciones de las Naciones Unidas, entre ellas las resoluciones 181 y 242 de esta Asamblea General. Igualmente, hacemos un llamado urgente para dar cabal y pronto cumplimiento a la resolución 2334 del Consejo de Seguridad, donde se reafirma que el establecimiento de asentamientos por parte de Israel en el territorio palestino ocupado, incluida Jerusalén Oriental, no tiene validez legal y constituye una flagrante violación del derecho internacional y un obstáculo importante para el logro de la solución biestatal y de una paz general, justa y duradera. Chile respaldó decididamente la resolución 77/274 de la Asamblea General y realizamos una presentación escrita ante la Corte Internacional de Justicia
highlight the rulings of the ICC in its advisory opinion on the applications of continued violations by Israel of the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination. We hope that the court can assist the international community when it comes to verifying the legal obligations that serve as a basis for the quest for a definitive solution which will guarantee the rights of all of the inhabitants of these areas. Highlighting Chile's commitment to human rights, international humanitarian law and support for the victims of the conflict in the Middle East, the government of my country has made available a contribution to humanitarian assistance for the civilian populations in Gaza and the Occupied Palestinian Territory. This support comes from the Chilean Fund Against Hunger and Poverty and will be channeled through UNRWA. This is the third contribution that Chile is making to this cause. President, we call on the parties involved to begin a ceasefire immediately. It is urgent that the blockade of Gaza by Israel ceases also and that humanitarian aid comes to support the Palestinian civilian population. We support the calls for dialogue from the international community to prevent further escalation of violence in the region. This would only bring more and greater damage for the civilian population and loss of human life. We must recognize that the situation in Gaza has been condemned in many ways, and Chile has condemned these also. La revocación de permisos de residencia, la detención arbitraria de palestinos, incluidos niños y niñas, y la imposición de un intrincado sistema de puestos de control que no solo restringe la libertad de circulación, sino que también afecta gravemente los derechos a la educación, al trabajo y la salud. Chile reafirma que la región necesita y merece la paz. Reiterates that the region needs and deserves peace, and this can only be the result of negotiations between Israel and Palestine and the political will to bring together radically different positions. In light of the current situation, it is essential for the international community to take an active position to aid in deactivating the conflict that has already taken thousands of lives, the vast majority of them innocent lives. Like all conflicts, this substantially affects and disproportionately affects women, girls and boys.
Vemos con mucho pesar los hechos que están ocurriendo, y es un imperativo moral de la humanidad, amparado por el derecho internacional humanitario, contribuir al cese de las acciones de ataque indiscriminado contra la población civil. En ello, Chile ha tenido y seguirá teniendo una voz clara y consistente en los espacios bilaterales y multilaterales, buscando mecanismos de articulación con otros estados para impulsar las condiciones para un acuerdo transversal que contribuya a dar una salida política al conflicto. Reiteramos que se debe apoyar el empoderamiento económico y social de las mujeres afectadas en este escalofriante conflicto. De igual manera, llamamos a la promoción del liderazgo femenino en todos los niveles, puesto que esto es una cuestión estratégica para lograr una paz sostenible e inclusiva. Señor Presidente, por todo lo anterior, el viernes pasado Chile votó a favor de la resolución de protección de los civiles y el cumplimiento de las obligaciones jurídicas y humanitarias. Finalmente, nuestro país, Chile, hace llegar sus condolencias a las familias y seres queridos de las víctimas y expresa nuestra más sincera y comprometida solidaridad con los heridos. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chile, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Costa Rica to take the floor.
Señor Presidente,
President. Costa Rica regrets that none of the draft resolutions considered by the Security Council have been adopted despite clear efforts to address the very grave humanitarian situation. However, this General Assembly, through this emergency special session, is meeting to find lasting solutions to the emergency crisis in the Middle East that the Security Council seems once again to be able to offer a way out to. We regret that Canada's amendment was not adopted. Hamas and their actions since the start of this crisis have brought great suffering to the people of Israel and Palestine. My delegation voted in favor of the resolution only because, in light of the inaction of the Security Council and the urgent need to protect innocent civilians, the international community could not wait any longer. But it is very clear Costa Rica reiterates its strongest condemnation of the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October. These actions have no justification whatsoever. Hamas has shown itself to be a terrorist organization with no consideration for the most basic principles of human rights. Our solidarity, our absolute solidarity goes with Israel and to all victims since the beginning of the crisis. We recognize that Israel has the right to self-defense in light of the horrific attacks of the group Hamas, which does not represent the Palestinian people. Hamas should release all of the hostages. It should put down its weapons. All of those involved in the actions of the 7th of October should hand themselves over and be judged for their genocidal acts. We also condemn the use by Hamas of people and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, as shields in infringement of international humanitarian law. We are deeply concerned by the escalation of violence, and we remind parties of the obligation to adhere to international law, especially international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions and its protocols and customary international humanitarian law. Even in situations of conflict, there are rules. The most sacred of these rules is respect and protection for the life and security of all civilian people. The fundamental principles of international humanitarian law provide us with clear guidance in times of war. The principles of differentiation and proportionality are crucial. Access to humanitarian assistance is obligatory and it is urgently needed. The protection of civilians and those outside of combat is a very basic need. The specific vulnerabilities of the civilian population should be taken into account. A person with a physical disability cannot listen to an evacuation warning in the same way that a healthy person does and cannot follow the instructions in the same way. Also, children find that their fragility is increased in times of conflict. President Costa Rica notes with great concern the humanitarian tragedy that has resulted from the conflict. We stand in solidarity with all of the innocent victims, both in Israel and in Palestine. In accordance with the above, we wish to make the following calls urgently. First of all, we call again for the immediate and unconditional release of all of the hostages held by Hamas. Taking hostages in an armed conflict is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. The fact that amongst the hostages
We also know that there are boys and children and the elderly. It makes this situation even more serious. Secondly, humanitarian access that is secure, swift and unhindered must be ensured. Humanitarian actors need guarantees of clear, practical and permanent access in order to assist a population that is in desperate need, including through humanitarian breaks and corridors when necessary. None of these elements can be conditional upon any of the others. All of these are humanitarian imperatives in their own right. Finally, we call for an immediate ceasefire against civilians. Our priority should be to avoid any further loss of life of innocents and any further suffering. Costa Rica also calls for transfer of conventional weapons to the zone of conflict to be suspended in accordance with Articles 6 and 7 of the Treaty on the weapons trade. These weapons can be used to commit or facilitate grave violations of international humanitarian law and human rights. The only way to bring us closer to a lasting peace is to avoid creating further innocent victims and preventing further escalation of the conflict. President, Costa Rica underscores that the only sustainable solution to this crisis will be the establishment of two states that live in conditions of security under a just, lasting and comprehensive peace. Peace is possible, but it requires a firm commitment from all. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Costa Rica and now invite the distinguished representative of Maldives to take the floor.
Mr. President, we gather here under the Uniting for Peace resolution adopted by this Assembly in 1950. Each time that we have gathered under this resolution to address the issue of illegal Israeli action in occupied East Jerusalem and the occupied Palestinian territory, it is with profound shock that we are confronted with unrelenting images of human suffering. We welcome last Friday's resolution by this Assembly advocating for an immediate, enduring, and sustainable humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. We strongly urge the Security Council to unite and take resolute action to halt the violence against innocent civilians. Mr. President, the reality on ground is that of the 2 million residents in Gaza, half of them are children. 30% of those children are under the age of 10. And today, it is these young children that are suffering the most. Accepting the loss of these young lives as mere collateral damage is a severe breach of universally accepted ethical principles. It is a severe breach of international law, including the Geneva Conventions and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the standards that reflect the global consensus that the lives of innocent children must be safeguarded at all costs. It is a severe breach of our shared human values and diminishes the moral integrity of any society that chooses to tolerate it. Mr. President, the Maldives was accepted to the United Nations in 1965 as its smallest member. In our very first statement to this esteemed Assembly, our permanent representative stated, "Whatever the size of a country or its population, a free state can make a contribution to the cause of coexistence." These words our commitment to the principles of United Nations Charter and our commitment to the rule of law continue to guide our work at the United Nations. This is why, though oceans apart, Maldivians remain resolute in our support for Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause. In this recent conflict, the Maldives has donated 2 million cans of tuna to the people of Palestine. Though modest, it is a gesture that underscores our enduring commitment and unwavering solidarity with the people of Palestine. The people of Maldives are also making financial contributions and organizing fundraisers to provide support to our brothers and sisters in Palestine. We will continue to speak up for the Palestinian people, for the Palestinian cause, and for peace in the region. Our support is driven not only by our principles, but also by a moral obligation. We once again reaffirm our unwavering support for the Palestinian people in their legitimate quest for their inalienable rights, including self-determination. We are resolute in our belief that enduring peace can only materialize through the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state, founded on pre-1967 borders and with East Jerusalem as its capital. Mr. President, what we are witnessing today is not a conflict that started earlier this month, but a continuation of decades of oppression of Palestinian people that have shattered multiple lives and suffocated hopes of innocent people over several generations. We firmly believe in equal application of the rule of law among all states. Accountability must be enforced for violations of international and humanitarian laws, eschewing selective justice. This conflict is therefore not merely a legal issue. It is a fundamental matter of justice. But we have witnessed selective justice in play throughout this crisis. The evident double standard in the global narrative of this protracted conflict is concerning. The partiality, knowingly or unknowingly, serves to dehumanize and minimize, enabling and even justifying indiscriminate violence and further marginalizing the Palestinian perspective. Mr. President, the settlement of Israel-Palestine conflict is one of the major issues in which the United Nations Security Council has repeatedly failed. It has failed to take unified stance against acts of violence and hostilities directed at civilians and the protection of medical and humanitarian personnel as stipulated by international humanitarian law. These failures undermine the Council's legitimacy. We take this opportunity to emphasize the urgent need for reform of the Security Council to ensure its continued relevance and effectiveness in upholding global peace and security. We reiterate our call to the Security Council to act decisively, building upon this Assembly's efforts to halt violence against innocent civilians. Mr. President, the rapidly escalating crisis in Gaza has reached an alarming point, demanding urgent and immediate action. As airstrikes increase and the death toll climbs now over 8,000, a ground invasion has commenced, even as the Assembly calls for a ceasefire. The situation gravely threatens to expand the conflict further. The government of Maldives strongly condemns the attacks on medical facilities, including Al-Ahli Arab Hospital, and most recently the continuous bombardment surrounding the Indonesian hospital, Al-Shifa Hospital, the Turkish hospital, and Al-Quds Hospital. We condemn the unacceptable attack on residential areas of the Jabalia refugee camp just this morning. The attacks on places of worship and humanitarian workers. These actions not only cause irreversible damage to essential infrastructure, but also place the lives of thousands at dire risk, violating international law and basic human decency. We urgently call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and for strict adherence to international mandates safeguarding civilian infrastructure and personnel. UN agencies are sounding the alarm about a dire humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. We extend our heartfelt condolences to all families affected. Our thoughts are also with the humanitarian workers who have sacrificed their lives in service, including the loss of over 60 UN staff in Gaza. The Maldives is grateful to the UN, Egypt, and others for facilitating the entry of humanitarian aid through the Rafah border crossing. However, this is insufficient. We urge Israel to collaborate with its neighboring states to ensure uninterrupted humanitarian assistance and the delivery of essential services at the required scale. The blockade of Gaza must end to mitigate the acute humanitarian crisis. We echo the calls for respect for the rule of law and genuine political engagement to find a diplomatic, sustainable, and lasting solution. The Palestinians have placed their hope in international law, the UN Charter, and our multilateral system for their survival. It is abhorrent that we have allowed this hope to be met with nothing but hollow words. The sanctity of innocent life, particularly that of children, is non-negotiable. Tonight, when I go home, I can hold my son as he falls asleep in my arms. But how many Palestinian mothers and fathers are mourning the loss of their children? We implore the members of this august assembly to act with courage, not as a matter of political convenience, but as a moral duty that transcends borders and politics, for the sake of a more peaceful world. The lives of innocent children and families in Gaza hang in the balance. War is indeed not an answer. This emergency special session must continue to unite us. It must fuel our collective conscience to bring justice, dignity, and security to the Palestinians and to the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Maldives for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon.
السيد الرئيس، يرحب وفد بلادي باعتماد القرار المعنون حماية المدنيين واحترام الموجبات القانونية والإنسانية المقدم من المجموعة العربية، والذي يعد أول خطوة جدية صادرة عن الأمم المتحدة لوقف المعاناة الإنسانية على أرض غزة. السيد الرئيس، نجد أنفسنا اليوم أمام الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة، وذلك بصورة استثنائية. فالمكان الطبيعي لحل الأزمات التي تهدد الأمن والسلم الدوليين هو مجلس الأمن. لكن بعض أعضائه قرر منح الوقت الكافي لإسرائيل لاستكمال معركتها العسكرية، كأن 75 عاما من عمر الصراع لم تكن كافية لاستكمال المخطط الإسرائيلي لتهجير الفلسطينيين عن أرضهم وإحلال مستوطنين غير شرعيين مكانهم. السيد الرئيس، وجب علينا اليوم أن نقف وقفة واحدة من أجل إصدار قرار لوقف فوري لإطلاق النار، ووقف العدوان
an
العبثي
immediate ceasefire
والمبادرة بفتح
and to
الممرات
end a
الآمنة
senseless
لإيصال
aggression.
المواد
We must
الأساسية
open safe
لإغاثة
corridors
المدنيين
to
في
deliver
غزة
basic
المحاصرة
goods for the
وإسعاف
relief of
الجرحى
civilians in
وإنقاذ
besieged
ما
Gaza.
يمكن إنقاذه
Also, we must
من
rescue the
أرواح
wounded and save those
إضافة
lives that
إلى
can be
قطع
saved.
الطريق أمام أي مشروع
We
تهجيري
must
قسري
also
للشعب
block any
الفلسطيني.
project of
ففلسطين
forced
هي
displacement of the
المكان
Palestinian
الطبيعي
people.
والوحيد لأهلها.
Palestine is the only
السيد الرئيس،
natural place
الصراع
for these
الفلسطيني
inhabitants.
الإسرائيلي
Mr. President,
الذي صدرت في
the
خصوصه
Israeli-Arab
قرارات دولية
conflict
متعددة
for
لم
which
تنفذها إسرائيل
many international
ليس
resolutions
بصراع
have been
جديد،
passed
ولن
without
تنتهي
being implemented by Israel is
تداعياته
not
إذا
a new
لم
conflict.
تتوافر إرادات
Its
صادقة في
repercussions
حله.
will not end
وأثبتت التجربة
if
حتى
there
الآن
is no
أن
sincere
هذه
will to
المسألة
resolve it.
لن يتم
Experience so far
حلها
has shown
إلا
that this
إذا
issue will not
تحمل
be
المجتمع
resolved
الدولي
unless the
مسؤوليته
international
بالضغط على
community
إسرائيل
assumes its
لتنفيذ القرارات
responsibilities
الدولية
by
ذات
pressuring
الصلة
Israel to
وحملها على
implement
الانسحاب
the
من
relevant
الأراضي العربية
international
المحتلة
resolutions and
وإقرار
compel it
إسرائيل بحق الشعب
to
الفلسطيني
withdraw from
بالوجود
occupied Arab
وبالعيش في
territories
دولته
and
المستقلة
also
على حدود
recognize the
67
Palestinians' right to
وعاصمتها
exist
القدس
and live in their
الشرقية.
own independent state
وإلا
within these
سيستمر هذا
1967
الصراع
borders with
لأجيال
East
وأجيال
Jerusalem
من
as its
بعدنا.
capital. Otherwise, this struggle will
السيد
continue
الرئيس،
for generations
إن
and
الاعتداءات
generations after us.
الإسرائيلية المستمرة على لبنان والتي
Mr.
تطال
President,
القرى الآمنة على طول
ongoing
الحدود
Israeli
اللبنانية
attacks on Lebanon
دفعت أكثر
affecting
من
peaceful
20,000
villages along the
لبناني
border
للنزوح عن
have
بيوتهم
forced more
طلبا
than
للأمن
20,000
والأمان. كما
Lebanese
أن
to flee their
الاعتداءات
homes in
المتكررة
search
على
of safety
مراكز
and
الجيش
security.
اللبناني
The
وقوات
repeated
اليونيفيل
attacks on
التي
the
لا
Lebanese army
تميز بين
and UNIFIL
عسكريين
positions
ومدنيين
do not
وصحفيين وعاملي
discriminate
الإغاثة
between military
إضافة
personnel,
إلى
civilians,
استعمالها المواد
journalists,
المحظورة
and
دوليا
aid workers,
كالفوسفور الأبيض
and the use of
هي
internationally
انتهاك
banned
صارخ
substances such as white
للقرارات
phosphorus
الدولية
are
والقرار
flagrant
1701
violations
والقانون
of
الدولي
international
الإنساني.
resolutions,
السيد
Resolution
الرئيس، إن
1071
هذه
and
الانتهاكات
international
الإسرائيلية
humanitarian law.
التي يشهدها
Sir,
لبنان منذ
these
3
Israeli
أسابيع
violations,
تضاف
which
إلى
Lebanon
سجل
has been
إسرائيل
witnessing for the past 3
الحافل
weeks,
بالانتهاكات
are
ضد سيادة
added
لبنان
to
وأرضه
Israel's
التي
record
لا
full
يزال
of
جزء
violations
منها
against
محتلا
Lebanon's
في
sovereignty
تلال
and land,
كفر
part of which
ومزارع
is
شبع
still
وخراج بلدة
occupied
الماري
in the
التي
Shiba
تشمل
farm
بجزء
area
منها
in Kafr
التمدد
Shuba and
العمراني
the outskirts of the
لقرية
town of
الرجاء.
Al-Mari, which
الدعوة
includes
اليوم
in part
للمجتمع
the urban
الدولي
expansion of
هي
the village of
للضغط على
Gashar.
إسرائيل لوقف
We call
عدوانها
on the
المدمر
international community to
وانتهاكاتها
pressure Israel
المتكررة
to stop its
واحتلالها
destructive
المستمر.
aggression and
السيد
repeated
الرئيس،
violations
في هذه
and
الأثناء
its constant
تشن
fraud.
إسرائيل عدوانا كبيرا على قطاع غزة من الجو
Mr.
والبحر
President,
والبر.
Israel is launching a major aggression against the Gaza Strip from the air, sea, and land. The certain result is thousands of innocent civilians will become victims, and therefore it is imperative that we act immediately. This is a responsibility shared by all countries to stop the bloodbath that does not distinguish between an infant, a mother, or an older person. We must beware any plans to spread chaos and internal disputes within the Palestinian areas. Today, the world is facing two choices: either remain silent about the transformation of Gaza into a mass grave of more than 2 million Palestinians, or immediately stop this war and start the path of a political solution based on UN resolutions. Mr. President, from this international rostrum, Lebanon calls for an end to the deaths, to the exoduses, the massacres, before it's too late. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Lebanon, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Yemen.
السيد الرئيس، أشكركم على
President, thank you for the resumption of the 10th emergency session of the General Assembly. Under the agenda item United for Peacekeeping, we align ourselves with the statement made by His Excellency the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Jordan on behalf of the Arab group, and the statement delivered by the representative of Mauritania on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Sir, this meeting is being held after the failure of the Security Council to assume its responsibilities in accordance with the UN Charter when it comes to international peace and security. At a time when the brutal aggression continues against Gaza and daily massacres are committed by Israel, the occupying power, against innocent and defenseless citizens, women and children. This aggression, this brutality, constitutes a war of genocide against the Palestinians. The Yemeni people condemn with the strongest terms possible the brutal and continuous Israeli aggression on Gaza and the destruction of infrastructure and the targeting of civilians, especially women and children, without discrimination. And this, we also condemn the cutting off of electricity and food and medications from the civilian population. This is a full-fledged war crime, a crime against humanity, and a flagrant violation of international law and human rights and international humanitarian law, as well as all international norms and standards. We wish to express our deepest condolences to the martyrs and their families, and we share our best wishes for a speedy recovery for the wounded. We wish to warn you that these actions will have serious consequences that will not only disrupt the peace process in the Middle East, but will also exacerbate this wave of violence and chaos, and it will increase feelings of anger in the region. This will give terrorist and extremist groups more reasons to spread bloodshed throughout the region and the world. We're meeting today when Gaza has paid with the blood of its sons and daughters. There are more than 7,000 martyrs who have fallen, including 3,400 children and 2,500 women. Some were buried alive under the rubble. More than 2,000 women and more than 20,000 wounded, of which 75% were children and women, are also a significant. There are also 2,000 people still to be found under the rubble. There was a new massacre that took place today in the Jabalia camp in the Gaza Strip, which led to approximately 400 dead and wounded, the majority of which were women and children. Today, we're meeting when Israel, the occupying power, has destroyed hospitals, health centers, schools, mosques, and churches. We are meeting today while Israel has destroyed a third of the Gaza Strip already and is razing its buildings to the ground. We meet today while Israel has stopped the provision of fuel, electricity, and food to 2.5 million people. And with all of this destruction, this aggression, massacres, and ethnic cleansing, some still hesitate to call things by their names and condemn these crimes against humanity and flagrant violations of human rights, international humanitarian law, and international law. This is a clear picture of the double standards that prevail in the world today. Yesterday, from this rostrum, many delegations spoke and lectured us about the principles of human rights, of international law, and human conscience, and they tried to preserve the high moral ground and condemned the war and brutal violations due to the killings of civilians and the siege. And today, we see them either silent or biased in violation of these same principles. We in Yemen understand these double standards, for many have given us lectures on human rights and infrastructure protection. This is a dark time for humanity and for the international system. The worsening of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the failure of the international community to stop the scourge that has exceeded all limits and stop this war is a moral failure. And now it is a failure of the application of international law and protecting common human values and innocent civilians. The silence on the part of the international community is complicity in crime and cover-up. Today, the infrastructure has been destroyed. Children and women have been killed. Entire families have been exterminated. Is this self-defense? Have international legal standards become optional according to color, sex, and religion? Has the application of these standards stopped at the borders of Gaza and the Occupied Palestinian Territory? All these questions need answers. We are facing a crossroads. We can either triumph for humanity and human conscience, or we will lose our humanity. Mr. President, we reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire and access, unfettered access of humanitarian aid and medical staff, and access to health centers and medical centers as well. Israel's prevention of urgent humanitarian aid into Gaza and forcing the citizens of the Gaza Strip to flee their houses is a grave violation of international law and international humanitarian law. And we reject the forced displacement of Palestinians outside their homeland or the threat of it. This is a violation of international law and the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949. What happened on October 7th, 2023 is the result of continued Israeli occupation over the course of 75 years. Therefore, a just and comprehensive peace is the only way to end this conflict, strengthen security and stability in the region, and establish an independent and sovereign Palestinian state on the borders of June 4th, 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, in accordance with the resolutions of international legitimacy and the Arab initiatives. Without this solution, the region will know no stability. Sir, allow me to wonder how much blood will be spilt before the public conscience awakens and stops this. If the international conscience is unable to win for the innocent Palestinians, then at least it has to triumph, or this will be a failure for humanity in the 21st century. What would you say if your children asked you, what did you do to stop the massacre against the children of Gaza? We, along with all of our supporters, the supporters of truth, the international community, the Charter, and the principles of the United Nations, are on the right side of history, and history will record on which side you will stand. The international community, facing these crimes committed by the Israeli occupying power against civilians in Gaza, including women and children, we ask them to take on the criminal responsibility of Israel. Criminals must be brought to justice and must be punished. The principles of humanity, justice, independence, and international law will prevail and triumph. And force will not triumph over the power of right. In conclusion, we thank all member states who voted in favor of the draft resolution of the General Assembly, which focused on the importance of stopping the war and protecting civilians, and to allow the arrival of humanitarian aid in a rapid manner and to respect international legal constraints. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Yemen, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I express my deep appreciation for the prompt and timely reconvening of the General Assembly's 10th Emergency Special Session on the question of Palestine. A time yet another tragically marked in the long history of the Palestinian people who continue to be under occupation for half a century. We align ourselves with the statement delivered on behalf of the Arab Group and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation by Jordan and Mauritania, respectively. The ongoing conflict has resulted in countless lives being lost and a humanitarian crisis that can no longer be ignored. At the outset, I would like to begin by expressing my heartfelt condolences to the Palestinian people and government over the loss of thousands of innocent civilian lives, including women and children of Al-Ahli Arab Hospital, and offer my wishes for the speedy recovery of the injured ones. I pray Almighty God to bestow His strength and resilience on the people of Palestine. The protection of civilians is a fundamental principle of international law and a moral imperative that should guide our actions. Regardless of the political complexities and historical context, we must prioritize the safety and well-being of innocent men, women, and children caught in the crossfire of this protracted conflict. In the Occupied Palestinian Territory, civilians have endured years of violence, displacement, and a constant state of fear under a ruthless occupation. They face daily challenges that threaten their basic human rights, like access to clean water, healthcare, education, and a sense of security. The endless, indiscriminate use of force by the occupying force, including bombing of schools, shelling of hospitals, and missile attacks on residential areas and camps, has taken a devastating toll on innocent Palestinian lives. It's incumbent upon the international community to act swiftly and decisively to ensure the protection of civilians. First and foremost, it's crucial to establish safe zones and humanitarian corridors to provide essential aid and assistance to those in need. I commend the United Nations Relief and Works Agency's vital role in coordinating relief efforts and emphasizing the need for generous donors to provide the agency with sufficient, predictable, and sustainable funding. Furthermore, we encourage the neighboring countries, civil society, and private sector to redouble their efforts in alleviating the suffering of the Palestinians inside and outside the occupied territories. Second, all parties involved must commit to an immediate unconditional ceasefire and adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law, which prohibits the targeting of civilians, UN staff, journalists, civilian infrastructure, and safe zones. Accountability for violations must be pursued through impartial investigations, and those responsible for war crimes must be held accountable for their actions. Third, diplomatic efforts need to be intensified to find a lasting and just solution to the conflict. Dialogue, negotiations, and a commitment to a two-state solution are essential to achieving a peaceful coexistence. The international community must actively revive these efforts and encourage all parties to engage in meaningful dialogue with the aim of reaching a comprehensive and a lasting peace agreement. Finally, education and raising awareness are also a crucial component of addressing the conflict. By raising awareness about the plight of the Palestinian people, we can counter misinformation and monopolization of the narrative in order to foster empathy and understanding about their legitimate national aspiration of self-determination. Educating ourselves and future generations about the historical and political context of this conflict can help break down stereotypes and prejudice while achieving a more balanced and nuanced understanding of the situation. In conclusion, the protection of civilians is an urgent and pressing issue that demands our immediate attention at this critical juncture. We must advocate for the respect of international law, establish safe zones, raising awareness about the plight of the Palestinians, and pursue diplomatic solutions to end the conflict. I reiterate that the only viable option for the resolution of the long-standing conflict is the end of the occupation of the Palestinian and the full recognition of a free, sovereign, and independent Palestine with East Jerusalem as its capital in accordance with relevant resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. Somali government and its people will continue to support and stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people and government in their unwavering pursuit of their legitimate rights, including to live in peace within secure and internationally recognized borders. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Somalia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Señor Presidente, aún no se han cumplido 2 años de la adopción de la resolución 76/262 y 6 veces ha convocado ya a esta Asamblea General el ejercicio del veto en 7 ocasiones por parte de los miembros permanentes del Consejo de Seguridad. En esta ocasión nos convoca en primer lugar el veto ejercido el pasado 18 de octubre por Estados Unidos al proyecto de resolución S/2023/773, un proyecto que obtuvo 12 votos a favor con 2 abstenciones y que tenía un carácter esencialmente humanitario con el fin de detener el sufrimiento de la población civil tanto en Israel como en Palestina. México considera inaceptable el uso de cualquier veto para impedir la acción del Consejo de Seguridad
to impede action of the Security Council is unacceptable, and this most recent case is no exception. Since 1945, Mexico has had an unshakable position against the use of the veto by permanent members of the Security Council. This faculty has been exercised in breach of the solemn commitment of 4 permanent members on the 7th of June 1945 at the San Francisco Conference. At that time, they declared.
It is not to be assumed, however, that the permanent members, any more than the non-permanent members, would use their veto power willfully to obstruct the operation of the Council. La realidad ha sido lamentablemente muy distinta. Recordamos en esta ocasión que en su intervención durante el debate de alto nivel de la 77 Asamblea General, el presidente Biden afirmó lo siguiente desde esta tribuna. Members of the UN Security Council, including the United States, should consistently uphold and defend the UN Charter and refrain from the use of veto except in rare, extraordinary situations to ensure that the Council remains credible and effective. Es lamentable que el veto al proyecto de resolución S/2023/773 haya puesto en duda precisamente la credibilidad y la efectividad del Consejo, especialmente en un momento en el que su acción resulta tan urgente. El proyecto de resolución en comento era un texto equilibrado y que tenía los elementos más importantes y urgentes bajo las circunstancias que vivan y que precisamente habría asegurado que el Consejo se mantuviera estuviera creíble y
specifically
eficaz.
had ensured
Tomando
that
en
the
cuenta
Security
la
Council
gravedad y
continues
la
to be credible
fragilidad de la
and
situación en el
effective.
terreno, nada
Given the
justificaba
gravity
impedir
and the
la adopción
fragility
de
of the
este
situation on the
proyecto,
ground,
cuya
there
primera
is no
versión fue
justification for
copatrocinada
impeding
por
the
México.
adoption of this draft. The first version
A
was
este
actually
veto se
co-sponsored
suma
by
el que fue
Mexico. In addition
ejercido
to
por
this
parte de
veto,
Rusia y China al proyecto de resolución
was another used by
2023
Russia and China to draft
792,
resolution
presentado a su vez por la delegación de
this
Estados
time
Unidos.
presented by
En
the
este
delegation of the
caso, la
United
votación
States. In
contó
this
con
case,
10 votos a favor,
after
3
the
en
vote, there
contra
were 10
y 2
votes in favor,
abstenciones.
3 against, and
En
2
opinión de mi
abstentions.
delegación,
In the opinion
a
of my
diferencia del
delegation,
texto brasileño que
unlike
logró
the
obtener más
Brazilian
apoyo entre los
text
miembros
that
del
was able
Consejo,
to garner more
este
support
proyecto no
from members
partía de
of
un
the
enfoque
Council, this
equilibrado.
draft
No obstante,
did
un
not
veto es un
come
veto
from a
y mi
balanced
delegación
approach. Nevertheless,
reconoce
a
que al haber
veto is a
obtenido
veto,
los
and my
votos
delegation
necesarios para
recognizes
su
that
adopción, nuevamente la
having
acción de 2
obtained
miembros
the necessary votes
permanentes
for its
volvió a
adoption,
paralizar
the
al Consejo
action
de
of 2
Seguridad.
permanent members has once
Es
again
importante
caused a
mencionar que
deadlock
este
in the
último
Security
veto
Council. It is
estuvo
important to
seguido
mention that
inmediatamente
this
después
last veto
del
was
rechazo
immediately
del
followed
proyecto
by
de resolución
rejection of draft resolution
S/2023/795
S/2023/795
presentado por Rusia,
that
el cual
was
contó con solo
presented
4
by
votos a
Russia.
favor, 2
This
en contra
had
y
4
9
votes in favor,
abstenciones.
2 against, and
Esta
9
dinámica de
abstentions.
rechazos mutuos
This
proclamada como
cycle
crónica de una muerte
of mutual
anunciada por ambos proponentes
rejection
en sus
declared as a chronicle of
intervenciones
a
en el
death
debate
foretold by
sobre el
both
Medio Oriente el pasado miércoles
proponents
24
in
de
their
octubre también es tóxica y
interventions of the debate
refleja
on
la
the Middle East on
disfuncionalidad
Wednesday,
en la que
24th
se
of
puede
October
caer
is also
o en la
toxic
que
and
puede caer
reflects
este órgano.
the
Recuerda
dysfunctionality that may
también
now
las malas
characterize
prácticas de
this
parálisis
body.
en la época de la
It
Guerra
also
Fría
reminds us
y mi
of the
delegación en este
bad
sentido hace un llamado
practices
a
and
frenar
stalemate from
estas
the Cold War
tácticas
period. My delegation
políticas que solo representan
issues
un
a
abuso
call
del
to
Consejo de
halt these
Seguridad
political
a
tactics that
costa
only
de quienes
represent an
sufren
abuse of the
en el
Security
terreno.
Council at the
No
expense of those who are
podemos
suffering on the
ni
ground.
debemos perder
We
de vista
cannot
que lo
and
que
we
está en
must not
juego
lose sight of
son
the fact that what
vidas
is at
humanas.
stake here are human
En este
lives.
contexto, México
In this
reitera su
context,
llamado a
Mexico
quienes no lo han
reiterates its
hecho a
call
sumarse a
to
la
those who have not
iniciativa
yet done so to
franco-mexicana sobre
join
la
the French
restricción
and
del uso del
Mexican
veto
initiative on
y que cuenta
restriction of
ya
the
con
use of the veto
106
that now has
signatarios.
106
Señor
signatories.
presidente, como lo
President,
señalamos en el Consejo
as
de
we
Seguridad,
indicated at the Security
México
Council,
condena de
Mexico
manera enérgica
condemns
e
in an
inequívoca el
energetic and
terrorismo y
unequivocal
el
way
extremismo violento
terrorism and
en todas
extremist
sus
violence
formas
in
y
all of its forms and
manifestaciones,
manifestations,
independientemente de
independently of
quién, dónde y
who
bajo qué
commits it,
propósito
where it
se
is
comete.
committed, under what
Reiteramos nuestra enérgica
rationalization.
condena a los ataques
We
terroristas
reiterate our
contra el
strong
pueblo de Israel el 7
condemnation
de
of the
octubre por
terrorist
parte de
attacks
Hamas
against
y
the Israel on the 7th
reconocemos el
of
derecho
October
de
committed
Israel
by
a
Hamas, and we
proteger a sus
recognize the right of
ciudadanos
Israel
y
to
su
protect its
territorio,
citizens
así
and
como
territory,
garantizar su
as well
seguridad
as that
siempre que se haga
right
con
to
pleno
guarantee
apego
their
al derecho
security,
internacional
provided
y en
that it
plena
is done
observancia
in
de los
strict
principios de
adherence to
necesidad
international law
y
and in full
proporcionalidad
observance of the
que
principles of
rigen cualquier uso de
necessity
la
and
fuerza.
proportionality that govern any
Una vez
use
más,
of force.
exigimos de
Once
Hamas la
again,
liberación inmediata y
we
sin
demand that
condiciones de los
Hamas
rehenes
immediately and
bajo su
unconditionally
custodia
release any
entre los que se
hostages under
encuentran
its
nacionales
custody,
mexicanos.
which
Igualmente nos
includes
preocupa que, de
Mexican
acuerdo con
nationals.
OCHA, la respuesta israelí ha tenido hasta
We
el
are
momento
also
un saldo de más de 8,000
by
personas
the Israeli
fallecidas,
response
más de
and in
21,000
agreement with,
heridas, además de daños
according to
incalculables
OCHA, so
a la
far caused
infraestructura
more
y
than
otros bienes civiles
8,000
palestinos.
deaths,
Es terrible que por cada día que pasa desde que se reanudó esta sesión especial de emergencia tengamos que agregar miles de muertes a nuestra intervención. Esto debe parar. Condenamos cualquier ataque indiscriminado o dirigido contra la población civil bajo cualquier circunstancia, así como contra personal médico y humanitario o contra bienes civiles y de infraestructura esencial que podrían constituir crímenes de guerra. México reitera su llamado a un cese inmediato y duradero de hostilidades en todos los territorios palestinos ocupados, especialmente los ataques directos o indirectos en contra de civiles por todas las partes del conflicto, así como a levantar el estado de sitio en el que se encuentra actualmente la población palestina, teniendo en cuenta que las represalias son contrarias al derecho internacional. Damos igualmente la bienvenida al inicio de la entrada de convoyes humanitarios a Gaza, aunque aún no es suficiente. Es vital el suministro de servicios básicos, así como levantar las restricciones al movimiento de personas y bienes tanto en Gaza como en Cisjordania. De igual forma, debe permitirse el paso de personas civiles por ese corredor humanitario. Lamentamos Lamentamos profundamente la muerte de personal de Naciones Unidas y hacemos un llamado a revocar la decisión de retirar visas a funcionarios de la ONU operando en Israel. Aprovechamos esta ocasión para refrendar el total apoyo de México al secretario general Antonio Guterres y a todo el sistema de las Naciones Unidas en sus esfuerzos políticos y humanitarios en estos tiempos de crisis. Y conscientes de la grave situación humanitaria en la región, el Gobierno de México aumentará este año su contribución voluntaria al Organismo de Obras Públicas y Socorro para los Refugiados de Palestina en reconocimiento a su labor humanitaria que hoy es más necesaria que nunca. Señor Presidente, toda ocupación es ilícita, quebranta el orden internacional y contraviene la Carta de la ONU. Tampoco está consagrado el derecho a una ocupación indefinida. Cualquier adquisición de territorio obtenido por la fuerza es nula y carente de validez. Exigimos a la potencia ocupante cesar su ocupación y todos los demás actos que afectan la integridad territorial del Estado de Palestina en apego a las resoluciones pertinentes del Consejo de Seguridad. México favorece una solución política integral y definitiva del conflicto, bajo la premisa de dos estados que atienda las legítimas preocupaciones de seguridad de Israel y permita la consolidación del Estado de Palestina viable política y económicamente, que conviva con Israel dentro de fronteras seguras e internacionalmente reconocidas, de conformidad con las resoluciones pertinentes del Consejo de Seguridad. Y como señalara la secretaria de Relaciones Exteriores de México el pasado 23 de septiembre, en esta tribuna debemos reconocer el derecho del pueblo de Israel, pero no a expensas del pueblo palestino. En conclusión, señor Presidente, esperamos que el Consejo de Seguridad esté a la altura de la gravedad de la situación y actúe lo más pronto posible para evitar, en primer lugar, que se sigan perdiendo vidas, así como para abrir un nuevo capítulo de asistencia humanitaria y de diálogo político. Es en las horas más oscuras, cuando el panorama se ve más incierto y difícil, que estamos obligados a redoblar esfuerzos para terminar con los ciclos de violencia, relanzar y hacer viable la solución de los estados para dos pueblos, procurando para ambos la seguridad de poder vivir en paz. Por lo tanto, hagamos realidad los principios que asumimos todos hace 78 años. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Madam President, 50 years ago this month, the 1973 Arab-Israeli War began. 30 years ago, the Oslo Accords were signed. 26 years ago, the first meeting of the 10th Emergency Special Session of this body was held. Who could have imagined we would still be here today? The horrifying series of events that began on 7 October continues unabated, spiraling ever downwards with far too many losses. Japan extends its sincere condolences to the families of the victims. Japan once again unequivocally condemns Hamas's brutal terror attack on Israel and its taking of hostages. The international community should never tolerate such heinous acts. Every member state has a right to defend itself and its people, and such right must be exercised in accordance with international law. Just recently, Israel announced an expansion of its ground operation in Gaza. The humanitarian situation in Gaza has never been worse. It is catastrophic, and the Palestinian people are in desperate need of food, water, fuel, and medicine. We also extend our sincere condolences to the families of the victims and for the loss of UN staff and personnel. This meeting was convened because the Security Council has repeatedly failed to take action. The Security Council, which has the primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security, should urgently and genuinely address the worsening crisis and prevent this conflict from spreading across the region. As a current Council member, Japan is working tirelessly with other Council members, in particular with the 10 elected members, to craft a resolution acceptable to all. The world cannot wait for the Council to finally fulfill its responsibility and speak in a unified voice. Several hostages have been released. More must follow immediately, as the families of more than 200 abducted victims are waiting in despair for news that their loved ones are safe. We demand the immediate and unconditional release of the remaining hostages. Japan fully supports the immediate humanitarian pauses and the establishment of humanitarian corridors to ensure that humanitarian assistance can be provided. Full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access consistent with international humanitarian law must be allowed. While dozens of trucks have passed through the Rafah crossing, hundreds more must follow to meet the dire needs of over 2 million people. We strongly hope for the early de-escalation of the situation, which will be an important step for durable peace and stability in the region. In this vein, Japan has recently approved a $10 million aid package as part of its response to the OCHA humanitarian flash appeal. More is needed, given the gravity of the situation in Gaza. We call on all member states and humanitarian partners to scale up their assistance to meet these urgent needs. But for the humanitarian aid to reach people in need, we need humanitarian pauses and humanitarian corridors. Madam President, the international community needs to work together to restore hope and pave a path for peace and security in both Palestine and Israel. Japan supports a two-state solution whereby Israel and a future independent Palestinian state live side by side in peace and security. All parties must make serious efforts to this end. For now, we must all act to de-escalate the situation with a sense of urgency. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Thank you, Madam President, for convening this important meeting. Malaysia, together with a group of countries, supported the request by the Arab group and the OIC for the resumption of this meeting. Malaysia aligns itself with the statement delivered by Mauritania on behalf of the OIC. We express our deepest condolences to the bereaved families who are mourning the loss of their loved ones in the horrific ongoing hostilities. Madam President, the magnitude of atrocities inflicted upon the population of Gaza defies all rational comprehension and has shocked our human sensibilities to the core. For more than 3 weeks now, we have been witnessing indiscriminate bombings, the killing of civilians, and the destruction of civilian objects and infrastructure. Sacrosanct principles of international law, including international human rights and humanitarian laws, continue to be violated. There is absolutely no precaution, distinction, or proportionality in Israel's actions. More than 8,000 civilians have been killed, including more than 3,000 innocent children. Around 70% of civilian fatalities in the ongoing act of collective punishment by Israel on the Gazan population are women and children. Water and electricity have been cut off, and the supply of fuel has been banned. To say that Gaza is facing a humanitarian catastrophe is an understatement. It is effectively a death sentence on the entire population. Under the Geneva Conventions, attacks on civilians, hospitals, places of worship, and other indispensable civilian infrastructure are unlawful and tantamount to war crimes. Malaysia condemns the heinous and barbaric attacks on the civilian population of Gaza, 40% of whom are children. All civilian lives, regardless of race, religion, and nationality, must be protected. We are also gravely concerned with the humanitarian calamity that continues to unfold. Malaysia joins others in demanding for an immediate ceasefire. This is absolutely vital to stop further loss of life and for necessary humanitarian work be carried out. We call for the establishment of humanitarian corridors, as well as unhindered and unfettered humanitarian access, so that aid can reach those in need throughout Gaza without any impediment. The supply of electricity, water, and fuel must be restored. These are life-saving essentials. Malaysia also condemns the blackout of communication services. Communication services are a lifeline. Communication infrastructure and the right to communicate must always be protected. 1.4 million, or 62% of Gaza population, has been internally displaced. Malaysia categorically rejects actions of forcibly displacing the population of Gaza. It is a flagrant violation of international law. In fact, those who heeded the warning to evacuate to the south continue to fall victim to indiscriminate bombings. Many have died. No place is safe in Gaza at the moment. The increasing settlers' violence in the West Bank, which has led and is leading to forcible transfer of Palestinians, is also deeply concerning. Madam President, we pay tribute to all humanitarian heroes who continue to serve in Gaza. We salute their courage and commitment. Their safety and protection must be guaranteed. In the last 24 hours, 3 more UNRWA staff have been killed, bringing the total to 67 since the war began. We join others in mourning the 67 UNRWA staff. Malaysia has been a regular contributor to UNRWA. Noting the extremely dire humanitarian condition in Gaza at the moment, Malaysia has decided to allocate an additional emergency contribution to UNRWA. We appreciate the important role of the United Nations under the leadership of the Secretary General. We also acknowledge the important roles played by countries in the region. Malaysia is ready to collaborate with all international partners to address the humanitarian needs of Gaza. Madam President, Malaysia shares the widespread disappointment towards the Security Council expressed by many member states. The Security Council, the body entrusted with the maintenance of global peace and security, continues to be paralyzed due to politicization based on narrow self-interests of some of its members. They continue to abuse their great responsibility and privilege, turning the Council into an arena for one-upmanship and blame game, instead of taking unified, swift, and decisive action to stop the war and save civilian lives. Their actions have exposed their hypocrisy, selectivity, and double standard. The General Assembly has stepped up where the Security Council has failed. We commend the 121 countries that had the courage to stand up for humanity and supported the resolution proposed by Jordan, co-sponsored by 46 countries, including Malaysia. The adoption of the resolution is a sign that we in the United Nations hear the resounding cry of people around the world demanding an immediate end to the massacre of innocent lives in Gaza. The resolution is a breakthrough and carries great moral authority. It is the important first step taken here at the United Nations, bringing back a glimmer of hope, faith, and trust in the multilateral process. We call on the Security Council to respond to this General Assembly resolution by taking prompt, unified, and decisive actions. Further inaction means continue being complicit in the crimes against humanity committed by Israel in Gaza. Madam President, according to UNICEF, Gaza has become a graveyard for children. More than 420 children are being killed or injured in Gaza every day. How many more children have to be orphaned, killed, or maimed? How many more parents have to go through the ordeal of burying their innocent children? What more does it take for some of us to wake up, open their eyes to the truth, and stand up for humanity? Be warned, history will judge. More than half of the population of Gaza are children and youth. They deserve hope for their future, not gloom and despair. Killing people will not kill their ideals. Wherever there is occupation and oppression, there is bound to be resistance. As free nations, we must unite to end occupation instead of perpetuating it. We must support the right to self-determination instead of denying it. The only way to attain peace and security for everybody in the region is by ending the illegal and oppressive occupation of Palestine. The vicious cycle of violence that its many generations have been enduring must end. Malaysia remains resolute in its support for the self-determination of the Palestinian people through the establishment of a free and independent state of Palestine in accordance with the two-state solution based on pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nicaragua.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, President.
Nicaragua
aligns itself with the statement delivered by Venezuela on behalf of the group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. Nicaragua joined the initiative to convene this emergency special session in light of the grave humanitarian situation that is unfolding in Gaza and in solidarity with Palestine and with all civilians, men and women, children, victims of this awful conflict, largely due to the failure to act and of the indifference now ongoing for decades of the Security Council. With the recent tragic and barbaric events in Palestine and Israel, it has once again become clear that the aforementioned Security Council continues to have a debt to humanity, to the international community, and to peace and justice, and above all, in the Middle East. It is regrettable that this body has not adopted a single humanitarian resolution requiring an urgent ceasefire and access and provision of humanitarian assistance, above all, given the very fragile situation of the population that is getting worse day by day in Gaza. We reiterate that the Security Council must fully abide by its responsibilities that were conferred upon it in the Charter, and it must do so urgently and without double standards. From this universal forum, we continue to vigorously condemn the further worsening of the terrible Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is causing more and more victims and greater pain for so many families. The world's recognition of this conflict, and especially of the inhumane situation that the Palestinian people in Gaza have been subjected to for more than 16 years, the occupation, the illegal blockade that has been imposed on them, all of this has converted this territory into a huge open-air prison, impoverishing a population of 2.3 million people, half of them being boys and girls. If this is to continue, it will only bring greater instability and insecurity to the Middle East and to the world. Nicaragua is convinced that peace and stability in the Middle East is only feasible through negotiation and through full implementation of all of the resolutions of the General Assembly and of the Security Council as regards Palestine. Nicaragua supports and will continue to support any efforts that will bring about a ceasefire. It is for this reason that we co-sponsor and vote in favor of the resolution submitted by Jordan on behalf of the Arab group. In this resolution, deep concern is expressed as regards the escalation of violence and the deterioration of the situation, in particular due to the very large number of civilian victims. We highlight once again that the priority at all times is to protect the civilian population. This General Assembly has the imperative responsibility to demand an immediate ceasefire and also the protection of the population of Palestine without double standards and in equal conditions as human beings. We must value lives equally for all. United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council are being called to take action as soon as possible to demand solutions by law and by justice in order to halt this senseless spiral of violence that has already been transformed into a genocide. We must also thank the humanitarian agencies and governments that are assisting in dealing with the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The horrors that we have witnessed and condemned, the attack on the hospital in Gaza that took the valuable lives of more than 700 individuals, most of them children. The Reconciliation and National Unity government of Nicaragua and the Nicaraguan people has always supported the just cause of the Palestinian people. It is a matter of principle. It is a matter of solidarity between brothers in their struggle. And together with the rest of the international community, we consider that it is necessary to intensify international efforts in the quest towards a definitive and peaceful solution that will culminate in the realization of a state of Palestine with its capital in East Jerusalem and within the borders recognized in 1967. This is the only way to achieve a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, living alongside the state of Israel in peace and security. Both states, this moral and historic obligation of all states to defend multilateralism, to defend the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, and the peaceful settlement of disputes, and abstaining from the use or the threat of the use of force in international relations. Our prayers to the families and innocent people who have suffered so much, to Israeli families, to Palestinian families, to families of various nationalities, families of personnel of the United Nations, and to families of journalists. Our love and respect goes out to each and every one of them. This situation of pain and suffering of the Palestinian people is shattering to us all. In recent days, thousands and thousands of people have been killed in Gaza. The attacks against medical installations are abhorrent, as is cutting off water, electricity, medical provisions, food and fuel. This has increased the insecurity of a population of 2.3 million people, half of them being children. They have no safe place to be or even to go. According to the recent estimates of the Office of the United Nations Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, more than 1.4 million Palestinians from Gaza have been displaced. More than 8,500 deaths have been reported. 67% of them are girls, women, or older adults. These figures include more than 3,800 children who have been killed, and every minute there is an increase in suffering and there is more loss of life. One thing is very clear, and it is being demonstrated at this General Assembly and in all cities around the world. Palestine does not stand alone. The people of the world stand with Palestine. And this should be reflected in the resolution that we adopt, and the thousands of protests of hundreds of thousands of people growing in number every day, including in the cities of countries that are hindering the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. Hundreds of thousands of people demanding peace, demanding a ceasefire, and to the end of hostages in Gaza, and demanding an end to the siege of Gaza and justice for the Palestinian people. It is time here in the United Nations that we listen to the people of the world and their uproar and put an end to the historic injustice imposed on Palestine. Peace must prevail at all costs and over all things in order to leave way to the only true and just solution: 2 states living in peace and security. All those present here know this very well. The Security Council has a historic responsibility that it must fulfill. It must now, once and for all, allow the full realization of the State of Palestine and so the realization of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nicaragua. Now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. The government of Guyana supports the convening of this emergency special session of the General Assembly in light of the deeply distressing levels of violence and hostility unfolding in the Middle East, particularly in the Gaza Strip since October 7th. The targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure and the resulting casualties and injuries, the mass displacement of persons, and the concomitant challenges of such movements are worrying, to say the least. The strike on the Al-Ahi hospital was nothing short of an illegal act of savagery that should never happen in any civilized society. The evacuation order to those in the Al-Quds hospital must also be seen in the same way. Guyana expresses heartfelt condolences to those who lost loved ones in these tragic and undignified circumstances, and we pray for the speedy recovery of the injured. We also commiserate with the families and loved ones of UN staff members who were killed in this conflict, and we commend the UN staff and other humanitarian actors who continue to serve in these extreme circumstances. Madam President, 24 days ago, the world woke to the shocking news of an infiltration of Israeli territory by Hamas, rocket attacks on the country, and the killing and abduction of Israeli citizens. We condemn these events in the strongest possible terms and underscore that they were violations of international law. Since that attack, we have witnessed a military response by Israel unprecedented in scale and impact, and one which has created a catastrophic humanitarian crisis in the densely populated Gaza Strip. To compound the problem, the Gaza Strip was under complete siege for the next 13 days following the attack. There was no way out and nothing could get in. Electricity, water, fuel, and food supplies were cut off. And 1.1 million people were ordered to undertake a massive evacuation exercise from the north to the south of the Strip. We are all aware of the abyss to which the people of Gaza have been driven on account of these developments, even as war continues. Hapless civilians continue to bear the brunt of these attacks. We were disheartened to hear the assessment that no place is safe in Gaza, since hospitals, schools, and other buildings that should be safe spaces in accordance with international humanitarian law were also struck in indiscriminate strikes. Madam President, Guyana emphasizes the responsibility of parties to the conflict to fully and unconditionally respect and uphold the principles of international law, including international humanitarian law. Even wars have rules, and the principles of distinction, proportionality, humanity, and necessity must be upheld. The protection of civilians is paramount, and we call for an immediate end to the indiscriminate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. Moreover, Guyana calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all Israeli hostages and for the immediate release of all Palestinian civilians unjustly held. We demand their safety, well-being, and humane treatment in compliance with international law. Madam President, the creation of a humanitarian corridor into Gaza is now an existential question, and Guyana was pleased to learn that the first aid convoy entered Gaza on 21st of October after 13 days of a complete siege. But this is not near enough. Before 7th October, at least 500 aid trucks entered Gaza daily. Today, it is a fraction of that. We call on those with influence, on the relevant parties, to exert all of it so that there is unhindered and continued flow of life-saving aid to the people of Gaza. A comprehensive ceasefire is crucial to the sustainability of the humanitarian intervention in Gaza. Guyana implores the parties to immediately cease the fighting and to choose the path of dialogue and peace. We also underscore the importance of avoiding further escalations of the violence to the West Bank and other parts of the region. We urge maximum restraint by all parties to this end. Madam President, Excellencies, true and principled leadership can never involve the overseeing of the killing of women and children. Shockingly, we have learned that more than 3,500 children have been killed in Gaza over these last 24 days, more than all those killed in conflicts in the world annually since 2019. Children whose joys had already been curtailed, living in the constant shadow of war and displacement. Children who already versed in the sounds of war could tell when hellish artillery was approaching, and not only since October 7. Children who nevertheless dreamt, perhaps believed, that this world, this United Nations, would ensure that they and their families live in their own country, in their own state, in peace and security. But even as we mourn these little ones cut down before they can truly experience what it means to live in peace, we see their surviving brothers and sisters being denied food, water, yes, water, and other basic necessities. And the hospitals to which the battered and maimed turn for a chance at life are denied fuel. Madam President, Excellencies, the international community has failed these children and many, many more before them. It has failed the people of Palestine, for more than 50 years. Guyana underscores the special responsibility of the Security Council to act in light of the threat that this situation poses to the maintenance of international peace and security. The current paralysis of the Council on this matter is therefore deeply concerning. We implore the Council to send a strong and clear message to the people of Israel and Palestine and the entire region that the rule of law will be upheld. In this context, Guyana was encouraged that this General Assembly did not falter when called upon to stand up for principles, justice, and the rule of law. We were among those who supported the resolution adopted last Friday, and we reiterate the provisions of that resolution. We call upon the concerned parties to adhere to those provisions as they are morally obligated to do. Madam President, Excellencies, let me underscore the importance of the responsibility and involvement of us all, the international community, in finding a solution. In the words of Guyanese poet Martin Carter, and I quote, "Like a web is spun in pattern, all are involved, all are consumed." The United Nations has a moral obligation to the people of Palestine and Israel to reinvigorate the peace process. It is the only way to guarantee the exercise of the inalienable right to self-determination by the Palestinian people and to address the security concerns of Israel. The Palestinian people continue to be pushed further and further behind, with their aspirations for development and peace strangled by cycle after cycle of violence and oppression for over 7 decades. The urgent realization of the two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders is critical. The government of Guyana is unwavering in its commitment to this objective and is ready to contribute constructively to any genuine effort to this end. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Guyana and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Namibia.
Madam President, thank you for resuming the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly under the Uniting for Peace resolution. This session resumes in the context of a world that is troubled, a world that looks to this august assembly as an international parliament of humanity to be bold and decisive and bring hope in these dark times. Allow me to draw on a life lesson that all of us have learned time and time again through each phase of our lives. There are two sides to every story. With this conflict in mind, Namibia is quick to caution that viewing a story from a different perspective should not be seen as disregard for the pain of the other. On 24 October 2023, during the open debate in the Security Council, we witnessed an unwarranted attack on the Secretary General when he stated that the attacks of October 7 did not occur in a vacuum. They did not, as this conflict predates this fateful day, and the pain and horror for both Palestinian and Israelis did not start on this day. Let me categorically clarify that as Namibia, we view the current conflict through the prism of humanitarianism, international law, and human rights. It is within this context that we call for the cessation of violence through a ceasefire, an end to the mass displacement of Palestinians, and an end to the attempts to starve Palestinians of humanitarian aid, including water and fuel. Last week, His Excellency Volker Turk, High Commissioner for Human Rights, stated that a binary view of the world rooted in "you are either with me or against me" is never going to advance peace. This is the message that we have for the Security Council, which has failed to take action in these dire times. These times when every minute that is lost has direct impact on whether people live or die. We urge Council members to set aside their differences and, in the letter and spirit of the principles and purposes of the sacrosanct UN Charter, save a generation that is on the verge of being wiped out from the scourge of war. History has taught us that war, wherever it happens, is the absolute worst experience for all affected. The wounds of war do not heal. Thus, the unabated killing and wanton destruction, callous loss of lives in this conflict must come to an end. Madam Vice President, Namibia voted in support of the resolution presented by Jordan because we are sensitized to the pain and suffering of the Palestinian people. Today, this august assembly, or on Friday rather, this august assembly showed that indeed, as was said by Martin Luther King Jr., the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. With the utmost compassion, I want to say to the permanent observer of Palestine and to his team that we feel the pain and suffering of the Palestinian people no less than we did when together we walked the corridors of the United Nations as oppressed people. We empathize with your protracted struggle for your inalienable right to self-determination. Namibia is with you on this journey, as it has always been. The injustices meted out against you should be enough to condition us all to put up the guardrails of international law, international humanitarian law, and the compassion that embodies the very notion of humanity as your protection from further brutality. Namibia will continue to push these frontiers in your name, using the systems, processes, and institutions at our disposal. Madam Vice President, last year this Assembly adopted an important resolution which requested the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on the consequences of the legality of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem. While this consideration is sub judice, the continued escalation of violence, especially over the last 12 months, reminds us that we have a responsibility to reject harmful rhetoric which dehumanizes the Palestinian people. Human animals do not exist. Palestinian people, like all members of the human family, are entitled to the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights that form the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. These are the guarantees that are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we regard them as fundamental and indivisible. Madam President, the resilience of the Palestinian people in the face of collective punishment against an entire population, despite the indiscriminate and disproportionate use of force for decades, should invoke in us a sense of duty, a duty to bring to an end the grave escalation of violence and show that indeed humanity and compassion are an umbrella that unite us for the common cause of peace. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Namibia and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Morocco.
سيدة الرئيسة، أود في البداية أن أشكركم وأشكر السيد رئيس الجمعية العامة على استجابتكم لطلب المجموعة العربية والإسلامية
positively responding for the request by the Arab group and the OSCE for the resumed external session, which comes within the context of an unprecedented crisis and serious events that would undermine peace and security in the Middle East region, that with the ramifications and repercussions that could affect the entire world. What we have seen over the last few weeks of targeting civilian objects, property, including hospitals, schools, and the violations of international humanitarian law and international law of human rights would create serious concern for the Kingdom of Morocco. And in this regard, the Kingdom of Morocco would reiterate 5 key points in this regard as follows. 1, to call for the de-escalation, stop the bloodshed and all military attacks, and also to save the region
ثانياً
from
الحاجة الملحة لحماية
wars
كل
of
المدنيين
military conflict in
وعدم
order to achieve peace and
استهدافهم
stability.
وذلك
Secondly,
وفق مبادئ
to
القانون
protect all
الدولي
civilians
والقانون
and
الدولي
refrain from
الإنساني
targeting
والقيم
them under
الإنسانية
the pretext
المشتركة.
of IHL. And
ثالثاً ضرورة السماح
the
بإيصال
common
مساعدة
principles of
إنسانية
humanity.
بسرعة
Thirdly, to allow the access of the
وبكمية
seamless
كافية
flow
لسكنة
of
قطاع
humanitarian
غزة
aid
فالوضع
with
الإنساني
sufficient
أصبح لا
quantity for
يطاق.
the Gaza Strip
رابعاً
because
رفض كل
the
الحلول
humanitarian
والأفكار
situation is
الهادئة
unbearable. Fourthly,
الهادفة إلى
to
تهجير أو
reject
ترحيل
all ideas
الفلسطينيين
and
من
solutions that
أرضهم
want to
وتهديد
transfer
الأمن
the
القومي
Palestinians and
للدول المجاورة.
drive them out of their
خامساً
homeland to
الحاجة
neighboring
إلى
countries.
إطلاق
Fifth,
عملية سلام
we
حقيقية
need to relaunch a
تقضي
genuine peace
إلى
process
حل
that would
الدولتين.
lead to the two-state solution.
دولة فلسطين على حدود يونس العوستين
The state of
وعاصمتها القدس
Palestine
الشرقية
on
تعيش
the
جنبا
4th
إلى
of
جنب
June
مع
1967
دولة
borders
إسرائيل.
that live in peace side to side with the
في
state of
أعقاب
Israel.
قمة السلام
And after the peace
التي عقدت
summit
في
that has
القاهرة
been
يوم
recently held
21
in Cairo
أكتوبر
on October 21st,
23 أصدرت المملكة المغربية
the Kingdom
وثماني
of
دول
Morocco
عربية
and 8
بيانا
other
يفعل
Arab
مجلس
states
الأمن
issued a statement
بإلزام
requiring the
الأطراف
Security
بالوقف
Council to make
الفوري
it binding
والاستدامة لإطلاق
to the
النار
parties to the conflict to
وضمان
immediately
وتسهيل النفاذ
unconditionally reach a
السريع
ceasefire
والآمن
and to
والمستدام
provide
للمساعدات الإنسانية
safe
إلى
and
قطاع
rapid
غزة
access of
دون
humanitarian
عوائق.
relief to Gaza Strip without any
سيد
hindrance.
الرئيس
Mr.
في
President,
إطار التزام ثابت بصاحب جلالة الملك محمد
within
السادس
his
نصره
firm
الله
commitment, His Majesty
رئيس
King
لجنة
Mohammed
القدس
VI, who is
بفائدة
the
القضية
chairman of
الفلسطينية
the Jerusalem Committee
وبتعليمات سامية من
for the best
جلالته
interest of the Palestinian
أرسلت
cause, and
المملكة
on his
المغربية
instruction, the
مساعدات
Kingdom of Morocco
إنسانية
has
عاجلة
sent
لفائدة
rapid
السكان
and urgent
الفلسطينيين
humanitarian
وتم
aid to the
تسليم
Palestinian
حمولات هذه الهلال
population,
الأحمر المصري
and we've delivered it to
لإدخالها إلى قطاع
the
غزة.
Egyptian Red Cross to
كما قامت
guarantee its
وكالة بيت
access
مال
into
القدس
Gaza Strip, and also the
بتعليمات ملكية سامية
Finance
صاحب
House
جلالة
of
الملك محمد
Jerusalem,
السادس رئيس لجنة القدس
headed
بإرسال
by
مساهمة
His
بالمؤسسات
Majesty King Mohammed
الاستشفائية
VI,
والاجتماعية
in order
الرئيسية
to
التي
send such
تتكفل بحالات الطوارئ الصحية
financing
والاجتماعية
requirements to
الناجمة
the
عن
medical
تطورات
facilities and
الأوضاع
social institutions
في قطاع
that are
غزة.
addressing the
سيد الرئيس
needs
فقد
resulting
دعت
from the
المجموعات
developments of the situation in
العربية
Gaza.
والإسلامية وعدم
Mr.
الانحياز
President,
إلى عقد
the
هذه
Arabic
الدورة
group OIC
الاستثنائية
and
بعد
non-allied
عدم
movement
تمكن مجلس
has called
الأمن
for
من
this
اعتماد
extraordinary session
قرار
after the
يضع
Security
حدا
Council
للوضع
failed to
المأساوي في
adopt a
غزة.
resolution that would put an end to
ونتمنى
the tragic
أن
situation in
يشكل
Gaza Strip.
القرار الذي
And
تم
we do hope that the
اعتماده
resolution adopted
الجمعة الماضية
last
فرصة
Friday
حقيقية
would create a
لإعطاء
genuine
آمال
opportunity
لشعوب المنطقة
to raise hopes for the
وخطوة
peoples
هامة
of the
في
region
طريق
and to make a
إيجاد
very
حل
important
لهذه
step in
الأزمة
order to find a
الحالية.
solution for the current
وتجدد
crisis.
المملكة
The
المغربية
Kingdom of
التأكيد على
Morocco
موقفها
reiterates its
الثابت
emphasis on its
والواضح
firm
من
and clear
عدالة
position
القضية
vis-à-vis
الفلسطينية
the just
وحقوق
and
الشعب
fair
الفلسطيني المشروعة
Palestinian cause and
وفي
the legitimate
مقدمتها
rights of
حقه
the
في إقامة
Palestinian
دولته
people,
الفلسطينية
including
المستقلة
its right to
على
an
حدود الرابع
independent
من يونيو
state of
67
Palestine on the
وعاصمتها
borders
القدس
of
الشرقية
June 4th,
تعيش جنبا إلى
1967
جنب
with
مع
East
دولة
Jerusalem
إسرائيل
as
كسبيل
its
وحيد لضمان
capital
الأمن
side
والاستقرار
by side
والسلام
to
في
the state
المنطقة.
of Israel
كما
as
تؤكد
the only
المملكة
guarantor
المغربية
of peace and
على
stability in the
ضرورة
region. The
وقف
Kingdom of
كل
Morocco also
الإجراءات
reiterates that we need
التي
to
تمس
stop and
بالوضع
hold
القانوني
all procedures
والتاريخي
that would
للمدينة
undermine the
المقدسة
legal and historical
خدمة
status
للسلام
of the
والاستقرار.
sacred city.
فمدينة القدس يجب أن تبقى أرضا للقاء ورمزا للتعايش السلمي بالنسبة لأتباع الديانات التوحيدية الثلاث ومركز لقيم الاحترام تبادل الحوار كما تم التنصيص على ذلك في نداء القدس الذي وقعه جلالة الملك محمد السادس رئيس لجنة القدس بمعية قداسة البابا فرانسيس في 30 مارس 2019 بالرباط. سيد الرئيس وختاما أود التذكير بما جاء في الرسالة التي وجهها صاحب جلالة الملك محمد السادس رئيس لجنة المعنية إلى رئيس اللجنة المعنية بممارسة الشعب الفلسطيني بحقوقه غير قابلة للتصرف واقتبس من الرسالة الملكية بقدر ما نؤكد أن حالة السداد في العملية السياسية بين الجانبين الفلسطيني والإسرائيلي لا تخدم السلام الذي نتطلع أن يسود المنطقة. نشدد نشجع الإشارات الإيجابية والمبادرات المحمودة المبذولة لإعادة بناء الثقة بهدف إطلاق المفاوضات جادة كفيلة بتحقيق حل عادل وشامل ودائم للقضية الفلسطينية وفق القرارات الشرعية الدولية وعلى أساس حل الدولتين resolutions and based on the two-state solutions in the court. The Kingdom of Morocco, led by His Majesty King Mohammed VI, who is the chairman of the Al-Quds Committee, would always hold steadfast to the option of peace and reiterates its readiness to coordinate with all partners in order to engage genuinely in any international efforts that would put an end to the current tragic and serious situation in Gaza. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the distinguished representative of Morocco, and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Madam President, today the extreme humanitarian crisis and the crime against humanity are being committed in Gaza Strip raise grave concern in the international community. Last Friday, the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly adopted a resolution calling for immediate and sustained humanitarian truce leading to the cessation of the hostility between Israel and Hamas, and demanding that all parties immediately and fully comply with their obligation under international law, including international humanitarian law. However, Israel, turning blind eyes to unanimous demand of the international community, has officially declared launch of the ground military operation in Gaza Strip. Thus, the Gaza is now hell where there is no safe place at all. The DPRK strongly condemns all indiscriminate attack targeting innocent people and critical civilian infrastructure like hospitals and schools. The crime against humanity being committed against innocent people in Gaza Strip must be stopped immediately. Current Middle East crisis is inevitable result of the illegal act of Israel in occupied East Jerusalem and the rest of occupied Palestine territory. However, some countries are further aggravating the situation in the Gaza Strip by disguising Israel as the victim and justifying the ongoing military aggression of Israel as exercise of the right to self-defense. At the UN Security Council meeting held on October 18, the United States cast a veto on the resolution to allow humanitarian access to Gaza Strip in Palestine for mere reason that the right to self-defense of Israel was not mentioned in the draft resolution submitted by delegation of Brazil. Due to the United States' one-sided support for Israel, the painstaking efforts of the international community to put an end to armed conflict, save lives of the greater number of innocent people, and defuse military tense situation in Middle East has failed. This clearly shows that United States is violating international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and approving and encouraging crime against humanity for only mere reason that Israel is its ally. Also, it has been proven once again that United States determined justice and injustice on the basis of the whether a performer of act is pro-US or anti-US. It is a typical manifestation of the shameless double standard of the United States toward right to self-defense. What cannot be overlooked is that some Western countries are resorting to smear campaign against DPRK to forcibly link the Middle East crisis to us. Some mass media belonging to US administration are spreading groundless and false rumor that North Korea's weapon seems to be used for attack on Israel. They are also building up public opinion that DPRK will make full use of the strategy of blackmail diplomacy, escalating the regional tension by taking advantage of the U.S. great interest in Middle East and Ukraine. Clear is the U.S. sinister intention. It is nothing but bid to shift blame for Middle East crisis caused by its one-sided policy for Israel and double standard onto the third country, and thus evade the international criticism focused on the United States. DPRK is watching with vigilance with illegal act of the United States, which has spawned war and armed conflict in different parts of the world, and shifted responsibility for them into the independent sovereign state. My delegation firmly believes that current critical crisis in Gaza Strip must be ended immediately, and all civilians must be protected through the full implementation of the resolution adopted at this General Assembly. In conclusion, my delegation once again expresses our unwavering support for and solidarity with the Palestinian people in their just struggle to regain their legitimate national rights, including establishment of the independent state with East Jerusalem as its capital. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you.
Agradecemos la convocatoria a este 10º periodo extraordinario de sesiones de emergencia reanudada frente a la agresión y al atroz genocidio que vive en este mismo instante el pueblo palestino. Señora Presidenta, la Carta de las Naciones Unidas establece con absoluta claridad en su primer artículo como el primer propósito de nuestra organización mantener la paz y la seguridad internacionales y con tal fin tomar medidas colectivas eficaces para prevenir y eliminar amenazas a la paz y para suprimir los actos de agresión u otros quebrantamientos de la paz. En esa medida, destacamos los esfuerzos que las Naciones Unidas han realizado para intentar resolver la situación del pueblo palestino y reconocemos las gestiones diplomáticas que en este mismo instante emprende el Secretario General y otros actores internacionales. Sin embargo, observamos que todos estos esfuerzos han sido insuficientes para otorgarle la paz definitiva y el derecho a la autodeterminación al pueblo de Palestina, que desde finales del siglo XIX, año tras año, ha sido desplazado de su territorio originario por intereses coloniales. Nuestra organización, las Naciones Unidas, está en deuda con el pueblo palestino, porque no hemos logrado concluir aquello que proyectamos como solución para la paz definitiva y duradera en el año 1947. Mientras nuestras acciones avanzan lentamente, Israel se benefició de la resolución que le da la existencia como Estado y desde ese momento hasta hoy, como potencia ocupante, desconoce todas las demás decisiones y resoluciones de las Naciones Unidas. Esta es una clara demostración de desprecio e irrespeto a la comunidad internacional y a todo el desarrollo del derecho internacional y el derecho internacional humanitario, que son la base de la paz y la seguridad internacionales. Presidenta, excelencias, colegas, rechazamos la pérdida de vidas en cualquier parte del mundo y el sufrimiento de los pueblos sin importar su nacionalidad. Es por ello que debemos actuar con urgencia y coherencia. Las vidas de las palestinas y palestinos tienen el mismo valor que la vida de todos los ciudadanos del mundo. En los últimos días hemos observado atónitos el ataque desmedido y genocidio de civiles palestinos en Gaza. Como se ha mencionado en esta misma asamblea, al día de hoy han perdido la vida más de 8.500 palestinos, de los cuales el 70% son mujeres y niños. Estamos viviendo un momento de inflexión en la evolución del conflicto, donde Israel, como potencia ocupante, ha decidido aplicar un castigo colectivo a los palestinos en Gaza, a quienes no reconocen su existencia destruye sus viviendas, escuelas, hospitales y los priva de sus derechos más básicos, dejando a la población sin alimentos, sin combustible, sin electricidad, sin tratamientos médicos, sin agua. La agresividad inhumana y los falsos argumentos del gobierno de Israel ya no son sostenibles. ¿Cómo es posible que el agresor ahora apele al derecho a la defensa poniéndose en el lugar de víctima? No se puede tapar el sol con un dedo. La potencia ocupante, el agresor, el genocida, es Israel. Los responsables de estos graves crímenes de lesa humanidad, crímenes de guerra, deben responder ante la justicia internacional. Presidenta, Excelencias, colegas, no podemos seguir mirando con indiferencia e indolencia a niñas y niños, seres humanos debajo de los escombros o vidas inocentes arrastrándose entre la devastación producto de las bombas y las armas de Israel. La acción de las Naciones Unidas puede salvar miles de vidas. Por ello, todos los estados y actores involucrados debemos asumir la responsabilidad de abogar por la justicia y la paz. En ese sentido, que mi delegación copatrocinó la resolución presentada por Jordania y fue aprobada por una mayoría aplastante de la comunidad internacional, para que de inmediato haya un cese al fuego y se atienda a las necesidades humanitarias de las palestinas y palestinos, así como de los ciudadanos de otros países que se encuentran atrapados en la región. Que paren las armas, que paren las muertes, porque la vida es el bien más preciado que tiene la humanidad. Lamentamos la inacción del Consejo de Seguridad por el bloqueo de uno de sus miembros a la resolución de Brasil, que se hubiese constituido en una oportunidad para la paz y una pequeña luz al final del túnel para los palestinos en Gaza. Hacemos un llamado para que el Consejo de Seguridad actúe a la brevedad y envíe a Israel un mensaje unánime, claro y fuerte para que de una vez deje de cegar más vidas inocentes. Señora Presidenta, Bolivia, respetuosa del derecho internacional, de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, de los Estados miembros, estará del lado correcto de la historia. Estará del lado de los derechos del pueblo palestino. En consecuencia, el pueblo y gobierno boliviano hemos tomado la decisión de romper relaciones diplomáticas a partir del día de hoy con el Estado de Israel, por considerarse un Estado irrespetuoso de la vida, de los pueblos, del derecho internacional y del derecho internacional humanitario. Presidente y colegas, reafirmamos que la única fórmula que podrá definitivamente garantizar la paz y la seguridad en la región es el reconocimiento pleno del Estado de Palestina con las fronteras internacionales anteriores a 1967 y con Jerusalén Oriental como su capital. Adicionalmente, en concordancia con sus resoluciones y decisiones, la Organización de las Naciones Unidas debe incorporar a la brevedad posible como Estado miembro pleno de esta Asamblea General al Estado de Palestina. Finalmente, Presidenta, Palestina libre no es solo una causa del pueblo palestino, sino una cuestión de justicia y paz global. La libertad y la dignidad de los seres humanos debe ser respetada en todos los rincones del planeta y es nuestro deber trabajar juntos para lograr un futuro en el que Palestina sea finalmente libre. Hermanas y hermanos palestinos, una vez más reitero que no están solos. Bolivia está con ustedes, los pueblos del mundo están con ustedes.
I thank the distinguished representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, President.
Es necesario que la actividad de las grandes potencias
necessary that the activity of the great powers
apoyan
in
a
one
las
way or
distintas
another,
partes en conflicto
that in one way or
en
another
Oriente Medio
support the various parties
se
to the conflict in the Middle
oriente
East,
a la búsqueda de
be rather
soluciones
directed to the
para el
quest for
establecimiento
solutions
de una
towards the
paz
establishment
constructiva
of a constructive
y no
peace.
obstaculice
And
posibles
it should
fórmulas de
not
acuerdo y
hinder
entendimiento.
possible formulas for agreement
El
and
conflicto
understanding.
de Oriente Medio,
The
por su carácter
conflict in the
explosivo,
Middle East,
obliga
because
a
of
las
its
Naciones
explosive
Unidas
character,
a
obliges the
intentar
United
sin
Nations
descanso
to
ponerle fin.
seek tirelessly to bring it to an
El
end.
24 de septiembre de
On the 24th of
1973,
September
el canciller
1973,
ecuatoriano
the
Antonio
Foreign Minister
Lucio
of Ecuador,
Paredes
Antonio Lucio
pronunció estas
Paredes,
palabras
spoke these
ante la
words
Asamblea General.
before the General Assembly.
Y como dije hace pocos días
And as I
en
said
el
just a few
Consejo de
days ago at the
Seguridad,
Security Council,
estas palabras siguen vigentes
these
luego de
words
más de 50 años.
are still valid some
Señora
50
Presidenta,
years
al
later, more
agradecer
than
la
50 years later.
convocatoria
President,
a esta sesión del
as I
10º
thank you for
periodo
convening
extraordinario de
this
sesiones de
10th
emergencia,
emergency
reitero
special
el más
session,
firme y enérgica
I
condena
reiterate the
a los
strongest and most
injustificables
vigorous
ataques
condemnation
terroristas
of the
perpetrados por
unjustifiable terrorist attacks
y
perpetrated
expreso
by
nuestras
Hamas.
condolencias más
I
sentidas
express our
a las
deepest
familias de
condolences
las víctimas de
to
estos
the
ataques
families of the
atroces.
victims of these horrendous
Nuestra
attacks.
solidaridad con el pueblo de Israel y
Our
con
solidarity
los
with the
otros
people of
países
Israel
cuyos
and
nacionales
with
han sido
other
afectados.
countries whose nationals have been
Exigimos
affected
que los rehenes tomados por Hamas
stands firm.
sean liberados
We demand
inmediata
that
e
the hostages taken
incondicionalmente.
by Hamas be
No hay
released
justificación
immediately and unconditionally.
posible
There is no
para
possible
atacar a
justification
civiles,
for
peor
attacking
aún, para
civilians,
usarlos como escudos
and it is
humanos.
worse yet to use them as human
Palestina
shields.
tiene el derecho inalienable
Palestine
a
has
su libre
the inalienable
determinación,
right to
así
self-determination.
como aspiraciones legítimas
It also
de
has the
vivir con
right to
seguridad,
legitimate aspirations
libertad,
to live
justicia,
with security, freedom,
oportunidades y
justice,
dignidad.
opportunities, and dignity.
Por desgracia, en estos
Unfortunately,
momentos
at this
se
time,
sigue produciendo dolorosas e inaceptables muertes de
painful and
civiles,
unacceptable deaths
entre
of
ellos
civilians continue to
mujeres
occur,
y
including
niños
deaths of
palestinos.
women and children of
Reiteramos
Palestine.
nuestra
We
solidaridad
reiterate our solidarity
familias
with their
y con su
families
pueblo.
and with the people of
Israel
Palestine.
tiene
Israel
el derecho a
has
defender
the
a
right
su
to defend
población
its
y a
population
ejercer la
and to
legítima defensa.
exercise self-defense.
Como todo Estado debe actuar de acuerdo con el
Like
derecho
all
internacional
states, it must
y con
act in
estricto
accordance with
respeto
international law,
a los
and it must
principios del derecho
strictly
internacional
respect the
humanitario,
principles of international humanitarian
necesidad,
law, namely
proporcionalidad,
necessity,
distinción,
proportionality, differentiation,
humanidad.
and humanity.
Incluso en las guerras
Even
tienen normas
during
y no hay
war,
justificación
there are
alguna
rules,
para
and there
causar
is
dolor y
no
muerte
justification
a
whatsoever
civiles
for causing
inocentes.
pain and suffering
El
to
Ecuador
innocent
está
civilians.
convencido
Ecuador is
de que
convinced
cuando se actúa de
that
buena fe,
when
no hay contradicción
people act
entre el
in good faith,
agotamiento
there
de
is
todos los
actually no
esfuerzos para
contradiction
la
between
protección de
exhausting
civiles
all
inocentes,
efforts for the
incluso en el
protection
curso
of
de
innocent
enfrentamientos
civilians,
armados
including in the
y la
course
garantía de
of
seguridad
armed
y
conflict,
protección que los Estados
and
deben
the
a sus
guarantee
nacionales.
guaranteeing
Por esto,
security and protection for
apoyamos y agradecemos los
the
esfuerzos
duty that
del
the states
secretario
have to
general
protect and
y de otros
secure
actores
their nationals.
para
For this
lograr
reason,
un
we
acceso
support and we
humanitario rápido,
are grateful for the efforts of the
suficiente
Secretary
y sin
General and
impedimentos
other
de
actors to
suministros
achieve
vitales a
swift
Gaza,
humanitarian
como
access that
agua,
is sufficient
alimentos y
and
combustibles,
unhindered for the
y así
provisions
evitar
of
que la
vital
tragedia
necessities to Gaza,
humanitaria
such as
en curso
water, food, and fuel,
alcance
and thus
dimensiones
avoid
incalculables.
a humanitarian
En momentos
tragedy
como el que vivimos,
and the one that is
todos los
currently being
actores
perpetrated,
deben mostrar
rising to
contención
incalculable
y evitar exacerbar
proportions.
las tensiones
At this time,
y prevenir
all
una
actors
expansión
must
de la
demonstrate
violencia a otras
restraint
zonas.
to avoid
Esto
exacerbating
solo
tensions and prevent
provocaría
expansion of
más
violence to
muerte
other
y más dolor.
areas. This would only cause
Señora
more death
Presidenta,
and more suffering.
la resolución
Madam
presentada
President,
por
the
Jordania y
resolution
adoptada por
submitted
esta
by Jordan and
Asamblea
adopted by
hace
this
un llamado
Assembly
incuestionable
issues
a respetar el derecho
an
internacional,
unassailable
el
call
derecho internacional
for the
humanitario
respect of
y el
international
derecho
law, for
internacional
international
de los derechos
humanitarian
humanos.
law, and
Condena
international human
todos los
rights
actos
law.
de violencia contra
It
civiles,
condemns all acts of violence
incluidos
against
los
civilians,
actos de terror,
including acts
lo
of
que
terror.
entendemos incluye a los actos
We
terroristas
understand this to include the terrorist acts initiated by Hamas on the 7th
La
of
resolución,
October.
además, fija la solución de dos estados. como base de un camino pacífico y negociado que ponga fin definitivamente al conflicto en Oriente Medio en concordancia con nuestra posición histórica respecto a este tema. Desde nuestro punto de vista, el texto omite menciones necesarias, tales como la alusión explícita a Hamas, cuya autoría de los ataques terroristas no está en discusión, y la palabra rehenes, deseable en aras de la claridad y la verdad. Por eso, votamos a favor de la enmienda propuesta por Canadá que habría subsanado estas omisiones. Las deficiencias del texto, sin embargo, no son mayores que la urgencia
The
de los
deficiencies of the
mensajes
text,
que
however,
envía
are not greater than the
la
urgency
resolución
of
sobre la
the
protección de
messages
civiles,
that the
tan
resolution
necesaria
sends on
en
the
este
protection
momento,
of civilians that
y
is
por este
so
motivo
urgently
el Ecuador
needed at this
votó
time. And for
a
this
favor de
reason,
la
Ecuador
resolución.
voted in favor of the
Señora
resolution.
Presidenta, desde
Madam President, since
1967,
1967,
la Asamblea
the
General
General
ha
Assembly
convocado al menos 3
has
sesiones
convened
especiales
at least
de
3
emergencia sobre el
emergency special
conflicto de Oriente
sessions
Medio.
on the conflict in
Son
the
ya
Middle East.
56 años.
It has now
Esta
been
décima
56
sesión
years since
especial
then.
fue
This 10th
inicialmente
emergency special
convocada en
session was initially
1997,
convened
hace
in
26 años.
1997,
Desde entonces
26 years
se ha
ago.
reanudado en 17
Since then, it
ocasiones.
has been resumed on
Las casi 8
17
décadas de
occasions.
conflicto, los miles
Almost
y miles
8
de
decades
muertos,
of conflict,
el
thousands upon
inconmensurable
thousands of
dolor y
deaths,
sufrimiento de
the
generaciones
immeasurable
enteras
pain and suffering
son
of
la
entire
evidencia más clara
generations
de que la
are
violencia
the clearest
no es la solución.
evidence
Es
and
tiempo de
proof that
detener la
violence is
lógica de
not the
buscar
solution. It is
culpables
time to
para
stop the
enfocarnos
logic
en
of
lograr
seeking
de una vez
to
por todas
blame
un arreglo permanente
others
a
and
esta
rather
cuestión.
to focus.
Por esto
It is now
reitero lo
time
que
to
mi
focus
delegación ha
once and for all
repetido
on a
en
permanent
innumerables
settlement to this
ocasiones
question.
en
For this
esta
reason,
asamblea,
reiterate what
en
my
el Consejo
delegation
de
has
Seguridad
repeated
y en otros
on
foros.
many occasions
La única
in this
manera de
assembly and in
terminar
other
con
fora.
este
The only
conflicto es
way
a través de
to
una
bring an end to
solución
this conflict
pacífica,
is through a peaceful
negociada,
solution,
definitiva
one
y
that is
justa para las
negotiated
partes,
and definitive
con la
and
existencia
fair
de dos
for the
estados,
parties,
Palestina e
namely the
Israel,
existence of two
sobre la
states,
base
Palestine
de
and
las
Israel,
fronteras de
on the basis of
1967
the
y de las
1967 borders
resoluciones
and
relevantes.
the relevant resolutions.
Trabajemos todos para lograrlo.
Let us all
Esta
work to
es
this
una
end.
responsabilidad colectiva.
This represents
Señora
our collective
Presidenta, finalizo mi
responsibility.
intervención
President,
tal como la inicié,
I will conclude
recordando un discurso
this
pronunciado hace cerca de
statement
3
as I
décadas,
began,
pero plenamente
recalling
vigente.
a
Esta vez me
statement
refiero a la
uttered
intervención
close
del
to 3 decades
31 de
ago, but
enero
still fully
de
valid, and I'm referring
1992
to the statement of the
del
31st
entonces
of January
secretario general
1992, delivered
Boutros-Ghali
by
ante
the
el
then
Consejo de
Secretary
Seguridad,
General Boutros
quien
Ghali
dijo,
to the Security
ante
Council,
todas
and he
las
said,
convulsiones de la sociedad mundial,
with
solo
all
queda
of
un
the
poder
convulsions in
que
global
puede
society,
imponer el
only one
orden
power
a un
is
caos
left that can
incipiente.
impose order on
Es el poder
incipient
de los
chaos.
principios
It is
que
the
trascienden
power
las
of
percepciones
principles
de la
transcending
convivencia a corto
and
plazo.
changing perceptions of expediency. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ecuador and now gives the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, President.
Argentina considera
Argentina
prioritario
continues it a priority
evitar de manera
to
urgente
avoid, as a matter of
los
urgency,
enfrentamientos entre Israel y la Franja de Gaza.
the conflict
Asimismo, se deben
between
hacer
Israel
todos
and
los
the Gaza
esfuerzos
Strip.
para que la crisis humanitaria en
All
la Franja
efforts
de
must be
Gaza
deployed
no se
in
continúe
order for the
agravando y para que
humanitarian
la
crisis in the
asistencia
Gaza Strip
humanitaria
to
llegue
not
a quienes la
continue
necesitan.
getting worse, and in
Es
order to ensure
fundamental
that
que la
humanitarian
población civil
assistance
sea
reaches those
protegida,
who need it. It is
sin
fundamental
importar
that we
su
protect the
nacionalidad.
civilian population,
Hamas
regardless of their
debe
nationality.
liberar a los rehenes de
Hamas
manera
must
inmediata
release
e
the
incondicional.
hostages immediately and unconditionally.
Argentina se suma
Argentina
a todos los llamamientos
joins
dirigidos
all of the
a lograr
calls
un cese del fuego
towards
inmediato y
achieving
sostenible.
an immediate
Por
and
todo
sustainable
ello,
ceasefire. For this reason,
Argentina ha votado
Argentina
a favor de la
has voted
resolución
in favor
que
of
hemos
the
adoptado en esta
resolution that we adopted
Asamblea General
in
el
this
viernes
General
último.
Assembly on Friday.
Mi país condena al
My
terrorismo en todas
country
sus formas y
condemns
manifestaciones. y considera que los actos terroristas resultan inadmisibles, no tienen justificativo alguno y deben ser deplorados por la comunidad internacional en su conjunto. En este marco, quisiera reiterar de manera enfática e inequívoca, tal como lo hiciera mi gobierno el pasado 7 de octubre, la firme condena de Argentina a los actos terroristas perpetrados por Hamas contra Israel. Argentina exige la inmediata e incondicional liberación de los rehenes de todas las nacionalidades, entre quienes se encuentran ciudadanos argentinos, sobre cuyo bienestar responsabilizamos directamente a quienes los han secuestrado. Si bien el país reconoce el derecho de Israel a su legítima defensa y a proteger a su población, enfatiza la importancia de que las medidas tomadas sean respetuosas del derecho internacional y del derecho internacional humanitario, en particular en relación con los principios de distinción y proporcionalidad. La población civil debe ser protegida en todas las circunstancias, de conformidad con el derecho internacional. La experiencia en el Medio Oriente nos indica que hospitales, escuelas e instalaciones de Naciones Unidas son los lugares más frecuentes a los que recurren los civiles para refugiarse. Estas instituciones deben ser respetadas sin excepción y cualquier ataque a ellas constituye una violación del derecho internacional humanitario. Mi país condena el ataque contra el hospital Al-Ali Arab, ubicado en el norte de la frontera de Gaza, que produjo cientos de muertos y heridos. La situación humanitaria en la franja de Gaza, tal como ha sido constatado por diversas agencias de las Naciones Unidas, es catastrófica. La población palestina residente en Gaza debe poder contar con acceso a los servicios públicos esenciales, a efectos de poder cubrir sus necesidades básicas fundamentales. Resulta imperativa la apertura de corredores humanitarios seguros, de manera tal que la ayuda internacional llegue con la mayor celeridad posible a quienes la necesitan. En este marco, damos la bienvenida a la reapertura del paso de Rafah, para el ingreso de ayuda humanitaria a Gaza. No obstante ello, ha dejado en claro Naciones Unidas que ese paso funciona de manera muy limitada en relación a su funcionamiento previo al conflicto. Esperamos que este sea de todas maneras un primer paso para la provisión sostenible de suministros esenciales de manera segura y sin obstáculos. Argentina está dispuesta a colaborar con los esfuerzos internacionales humanitarios a través de la agencia Cascos Blancos y en tal sentido hemos transmitido nuestra disposición tanto a palestinos como israelíes. El país está preocupado por el aumento de tensión en las fronteras de Israel con Siria y el Líbano, que podría ocasionar un mayor deterioro de la estabilidad en la región. Es por eso que hacemos un llamamiento a todas las partes para evitar que se produzca una escalada de enfrentamientos de consecuencias impredecibles. El país está convencido de que no existe una solución militar ni una impuesta a través de ataques terroristas al conflicto israelí-palestino. Por el contrario, es solo a través de negociaciones de buena fe entre israelíes y palestinos y sobre la base de la visión de dos estados viviendo lado a lado en paz y seguridad dentro de fronteras internacionalmente reconocidas, que se podrá alcanzar una paz definitiva en la región. Las Naciones Unidas y la comunidad internacional en su conjunto deben comprometerse nuevamente con la agenda de paz en el Medio Oriente. Los riesgos de inacción son más que evidentes y lo hemos estado observando con horror durante estos días. El Consejo de Seguridad y la Asamblea General tienen una responsabilidad de conformidad con la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y debemos asumirla. La credibilidad del sistema de las Naciones Unidas de ello depende. Asimismo, la comunidad internacional no deberá perder de vista que los palestinos de la franja de Gaza van a necesitar una ayuda internacional significativa y sostenida para la reconstrucción de la infraestructura básica, las viviendas, los edificios que ya han sido destruidos. Miles de personas han muerto desde el inicio de esta crisis. Por lo que antes de concluir, deseo transmitir en nombre del pueblo y del gobierno argentino las más sentidas condolencias
Argentina to extend our most deeply felt condolences to the families of the victims, be they Israelis, Palestinian, or of other nationalities. Argentina, as we have done in the past, will continue to support all efforts and initiatives for peace, for the benefit of the peoples of Palestine and Israel and of all peoples of the Middle East. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Argentina and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President.
Comienzo mi intervención trasladando las condolencias de mi país a los familiares y allegados de todas las víctimas de esta escalada de violencia desde el 7 de octubre, incluidos los trabajadores de Naciones Unidas que han perdido la vida en el desempeño de su deber.
Lost their lives in the course of their duty. It is extremely important for the General Assembly to be meeting to deal with the extremely grave situation in the Middle East and its humanitarian consequences. We decisively support the efforts of the United Nations, led by the Secretary General, to bring an end to the crisis. Following the terrorist attacks of Hamas against Israel on the 7th of October, the situation in the region has degenerating with a new level of violence with unforeseeable consequences for both the region and the rest of the world. The government of Spain has reiterated its strong condemnation of terrorism and violence and its full solidarity with the victims. Spain has recognized the right of Israel to defend itself against these terrorist attacks in full respect for international law and international humanitarian law. Spain supports the urgent request of the Secretary, called the Secretary General for a humanitarian ceasefire. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is getting worse every moment. Israel and the rest of the international community have a duty to protect the civilian population in Palestine and to enable access for humanitarian aid and provisions to the population of Gaza, especially drinking water, food, medicines, and fuel for desalination plants. We have expressed our great concern for the situation of more than 200 hostages, incling one Spanish citizen. All hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. The taking of hostages represents a war crime. President, the risk of this conflict spreading across the region is high. In the West Bank, we are concerned by the increase of violence by settlers against the civilian Palestinian population. We are also concerned about the stability in southern Lebanon and other countries in the region. We must avoid a further escalation of the conflict and a regional crisis at all costs. For this region, we must avoid political instrumentalization of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Spain is firmly committed to the work of UNFIL, and it is fundamental that we support it and we are contribute to reducing tensions between regional actors. As we said at the outset, we must focus on a credible path to peace in Spain has always been convinced.
De toda la población. Asimismo, destacamos las gestiones diplomáticas que países amigos y organizaciones están efectuando con el objeto de lograr una solución pacífica a través del diálogo entre las partes involucradas. Chile ha mantenido una posición histórica y consistente respecto a la solución pacífica de las controversias y el reconocimiento de los dos estados, Israel y Palestina, así como el derecho de ambos a coexistir en armonía dentro de fronteras internacionales seguras y reconocidas y con pleno respeto a los derechos humanos de todos sus habitantes. Esta solución, sin embargo, es lo que ha tomado un nuevo cariz a partir de los actos terroristas perpetrados por Hamas el 7
We unreservedly condemn the actions of Hamas as we do any terrorist act, acts of violence and hostilities against a civilian population. We therefore also call for the unconditional release of hostages held by this organization which has committed terrorist acts. They should ensure the well-being and treatment of the hostages according to international law. By the same token, we are concerned by Israel's military operation in Gaza, under the banner of self-defense of a state that has been under attack should be guided by the principles of proportionality, differentiation, and precaution. However, in light of the facts, this is not being complied with. Since the 7th of October, there have been bombardments of public infrastructure, civilian housing, educational centres, health centres, and even installations of the UNGA, the Agency of the United Nations, works agency, has refugees. The impact on the peace and security of the entire population. We also highlight the diplomatic efforts that friendly countries and organizations have been pursuing in order to achieve a peaceful solution through dialogue between the parties involved. Chile has held a historical and consistent position as regards the peaceful settlement of disputes and recognition of the two states, Israel and Palestine, as well as the right of both to exist alongside one another in harmony within internationally secure and recognized borders with full respect to the human rights of all of their inhabitants. This solution, however, is very far from becoming a reality. This has taken a new turn since the terrorist acts perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October. We unreservedly condemn and unequivocally condemn the actions of Hamas as we do any terrorist act, acts of violence and hostilities against a civilian population. We therefore also call for the unconditional release of all hostages held by this organization which has committed terrorist acts, and they should ensure the well-being and treatment of the hostages in accordance with international law. By the same token, we are concerned by Israel's military operation in Gaza, the use of force under the banner of the self-defense of a state that has been under attack should be guided by the principles of proportionality, differentiation, and precaution. However, in light of the facts,
Pues desde el 7 de octubre han sido bombardeadas infraestructura pública, viviendas de civiles, centros educativos y de salud, incluyendo instalaciones de la propia Agencia de las Naciones Unidas para los Refugiados de Palestina en Oriente Próximo, UNRWA. Nos inquietan estos recientes ataques y el recrudecimiento de la violencia en intensidad y frecuencia por el impacto que esto tiene en vidas humanas, heridos, destrucción de familias, huérfanos, soledad, desesperanza y la pérdida de sentido y fe en la vida misma. No cabe duda que esto marcará a varias generaciones y una vez que las balas se detengan, otras consecuencias comenzarán a sentirse, porque en la guerra no existe racionalidad.
There is no rationality in war. Indeed, violence cannot be resolved through
de igual forma, el bloqueo israelí a la franja de Gaza ha impedido el ingreso de suficientes alimentos, agua, insumos médicos y fuentes de energía, todos ellos elementos esenciales para la existencia humana. A esto se debe sumar la orden de evacuar el área norte de la franja de Gaza, que es un ejercicio de desplazamiento forzado de la población. Todos estos hechos atentan con las disposiciones del derecho internacional humanitario y los derechos humanos. Solicitamos que estos sean investigados por las entidades internacionales competentes para determinar y exigir las eventuales responsabilidades de los actores involucrados. Chile, de acuerdo con los principios permanentes de su política exterior, en el seno de esta organización, ha adherido a las decisiones referentes al respeto al derecho internacional, la preservación de la paz, el ejercicio de la autodeterminación de los pueblos, como también el respeto y promoción de los derechos humanos. Así, en relación con el pueblo palestino, hemos desarrollado una posición permanente en el tiempo, respaldando el derecho del pueblo palestino a constituir un Estado soberano, enmarcado en lo prescrito en las resoluciones de las Naciones Unidas, entre ellas las resoluciones 181 y 242 de esta Asamblea General. Igualmente, hacemos un llamado urgente para dar cabal y pronto cumplimiento a la resolución 2334 del Consejo de Seguridad, donde se reafirma que el establecimiento de asentamientos por parte de Israel en el territorio palestino ocupado, incluida Jerusalén Oriental, no tiene validez legal y constituye una flagrante violación del derecho internacional y un obstáculo importante para el logro de la solución biestatal y de una paz general, justa y duradera. Chile respaldó decididamente la resolución 77/274 de la Asamblea General y realizamos una presentación escrita ante la Corte Internacional de Justicia en el marco de la solicitud de opinión consultiva sobre las implicaciones de las continuas violaciones que por parte de Israel del derecho del pueblo palestino a la libre determinación. Esperamos que la Corte pueda asistir a la comunidad internacional clarificando las obligaciones legales que sirvan de base para la búsqueda de una solución definitiva que garantice los derechos humanos de todos sus habitantes. En razón del compromiso de Chile con los derechos humanos, el derecho internacional humanitario y en el interés de socorrer a víctimas inocentes del conflicto en Medio Oriente, el gobierno de mi país ha dispuesto a realizar un aporte para colaborar con la asistencia humanitaria para la población civil en Gaza y los territorios palestinos ocupados. Este aporte proviene del Fondo Chile contra el hambre y la pobreza y será canalizado a través de la UNGA. Se trata del tercer aporte que Chile realiza a esta causa. Señor Presidente, hacemos un llamado a las partes involucradas a cesar el fuego de manera inmediata. De la misma forma, es urgente que Israel cese el bloqueo y permita el ingreso de asistencia humanitaria para aliviar el sufrimiento de la población civil palestina. Instamos a mejorar los mecanismos de diálogo de la comunidad internacional para evitar una escalada de violencia regional que solo traería más perjuicios para la población civil y pérdida de vidas humanas. Con todo, hay que reconocer que la situación en Gaza ha venido precedida por una serie de denuncias sobre las que Chile se ha referido en los diferentes espacios multilaterales, entre las que se cuentan, aparte de las mencionadas previamente, los desalojos forzosos, la revocación de permisos de residencia, la detención arbitraria de palestinos, incluidos niños y niñas, y la imposición de un intrincado sistema de puestos de control que no solo restringe la libertad de circulación, sino que también afecta gravemente los derechos a la educación, al trabajo y la salud. Chile reafirma que la región necesita y merece la paz, y que una solución al conflicto solo puede ser el fruto de negociaciones entre Palestina e Israel y de la voluntad política de dejar atrás posiciones radicales. Sin embargo, dado el contexto actual, es indispensable que la comunidad internacional tome una posición activa para contribuir a desactivar el conflicto que ya ha cobrado miles de vidas, la mayoría de ellas inocentes, y como todo conflicto afecta sustancialmente y desproporcionadamente a las mujeres, niñas y niños. Vemos con mucho pesar los hechos que están ocurriendo, y es un imperativo moral de la humanidad, amparado por el derecho internacional humanitario, contribuir al cese de las acciones de ataque indiscriminado contra la población civil. En ello, Chile ha tenido y seguirá teniendo una voz clara y consistente en los espacios bilaterales y multilaterales, buscando mecanismos de articulación con otros estados para impulsar las condiciones para un acuerdo
states in order to put in place actions for a cross-cutting solution to achieve a political settlement to the conflict. We reiterate that this should be supported with the economic and social empowerment of the women affected by this harrowing conflict. We also call for the promotion of women's leadership at all levels. This is a strategic issue to help us achieve a sustainable and inclusive peace. President, having said all of the above, last month Chile voted in favor of resolution for the protection of civilians in compliance with legal and humanitarian obligations. Finally, our country, Chile, would like to offer its condolences to the families and loved ones of the victims, and we extend our most sincere and committed solidarity to the injured. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chile, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Costa Rica to take the floor.
Señor Presidente,
President,
Costa
Rica regrets that none of the draft resolutions considered by the Security Council have been adopted despite clear efforts to address the very grave humanitarian situation. However, this General Assembly, through this emergency special session, is meeting to find lasting solutions to the emergency crisis in the Middle East, that the Security Council seems once again to be able to offer a way out. We regret that Canada's amendment was not adopted.
Cuyas acciones criminales iniciaron esta crisis.
Hamas and their actions since the start of this crisis have brought great suffering to the people of Israel and Palestine. My delegation voted in favor of the resolution only because, in light of the inaction of the Security Council and the urgent need to protect innocent civilians, the international community could not wait any longer. But it is very clear, Costa Rica reiterates its strongest condemnation of the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October. These actions have no justification whatsoever. Hamas has shown itself to be a terrorist organization with no consideration for the most basic principles of human rights. Our solidarity, our absolute solidarity goes with Israel to all victims since the beginning of the crisis. We recognize that Israel has the right to self-defense in light of the horrific attacks of the group called Hamas, which does not represent the Palestinian people. Hamas should release all of the hostages. It should put down its weapons. All of those involved in the actions of the 7th of October should hand themselves over and be judged for their genocidal acts. We also condemn the use by Hamas of people and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, as shields in infringement of international humanitarian law. We are deeply concerned by the escalation of violence, and we remind parties of the obligation to adhere to international law, especially international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions and its protocols and customary international humanitarian law. Even in situations of conflict, there are rules. The most sacred of these rules is respect and protection for the life and security of all civilian people. The fundamental principles of international humanitarian law provide us with clear guidance in times of war. The principles of differentiation and proportionality are crucial. Access to humanitarian assistance is obligatory, and it is urgently needed. The protection of civilians and those outside of combat is a very basic need, the specific vulnerabilities of the civilian population should be taken into account. A person with a physical disability cannot listen to an evacuation warning in the same way that a healthy person does and cannot follow the instructions in the same way. Also, children find that their fragility is increased in times of conflict. President Costa Rica notes with great concern the humanitarian tragedy that has resulted from the conflict. We stand in solidarity with all of the innocent victims, both in Israel and in Palestine. In accordance with the above, we wish to make the following calls urgently. First of all, we call again for the immediate and unconditional release of all of the hostages held by